And we're live. Welcome to another episode of an Austro-Thomism Roundtable. We're going to be doing a live reading. We have a regular guys of Bulgakov, Oncast, and Andrew Popular Liberty. How you guys doing?
Howdy, y'all.
Awesome. Well, let's see. What is this? Yeah. Do we want to do any preference on who Eric von Knut was, or anything about it before we hop into the live reading?
All I know is that he was a Thomist Catholic associated with the Mises Institute, and very influenced by Mises himself and a political scientist. That's all I know from him, all the context I can give.
Yeah, that seems good enough. Let me stay on the screen and we'll get right into this. Home tab, Monarchy Wolf, sale. Okay, everybody see that?
Yep.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Oncast, you can go ahead and start the reading, and let's probably explain to the audience. So how we're going to do this, going to do 30 minutes straight of live reading, and then we're going to commentate afterwards, so we can try to get through this. Because if we just read it normally and commentate after we heard something good, we stop every sentence to comment. That's some commentate because everything here is just incredible. So, Oncast, go right ahead and get us started.
Sure. So as if Austro-Thomism believes in anything, of course, it's democracy, and I was voted on being the reader for this round, so I'll go ahead and take a crack at it. All right, so this is Monarchy and War by Gjergj von Knudelt. Modern history is nothing but an inventory of bankruptcy declarations. Nicholas Gomez de Vila. Monarchy is a form of government not well understood in North America. To many people in that part of the world, monarchy seems to be a totally obsolete, even childish institution. The surviving monarchies, after all, might still play a symbolic or even a psychological role, but not a decisive political role. As a rationalist and a liberal, in the worldwide sense rather than the American sense, I am also a monarchist who realizes that monarchy, combined with Christianity and antiquity, was responsible for the rise and flowering of Western civilization, which is slowly assuming an almost global character. Yet the modern mind is political rather than historical, and therefore is hopelessly tied to the spirit of the time. As Goethe wrote, "He who cannot give account of the last 3,000 years rests in darkness inexperienced, though he lives from day to day." Such a person, intellectually nurtured by the boob tube and newspapers, would be greatly surprised to hear British Prime Minister Disraeli say, "The tendency of an advanced civilization is in truth monarchy. Monarchy is indeed a government which requires a high degree of civilization for its full development. An educated nation recoils from the imperfect vicariate of what is called a representative government." Democracy is, after all, the oldest form of government in which majorities rule over minorities. Democracy reappeared in a more civilized form in Athens, but when, in a truly political trial, Socrates praised monarchy, he was condemned to death. Remember also that Magarigia said rightly that our civilization rests on the death of two persons, a philosopher and the son of God, both victims of the popular will. No wonder that Plato, Socrates' follower, and Aristotle, Plato's disciple, were fierce monarchists, and that the latter, when democracy returned to Athens, went into exile to avoid Socrates' fate. Plato's thesis that democracy naturally evolves into tyranny was also adopted by Polybius, who believed in an anacyclosis, a natural circular evolutionary process from monarchy into aristocracy, aristocracy into democracy, and democracy into tyranny. Indeed, reading Plato's Republic, books 8 and 9, one gets an exact description of the transition from the Weimar Republic to National Socialist tyranny. The historically conscious observer realizes not only that countries like Great Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands, which today are monarchies, went through Republican periods, but also that Greece and Mexico, today republics, have already been monarchies twice. Still, the most educational case is that of Rome. If we had the opportunity, given our knowledge of history, to meet a Roman citizen in the 60th year before Christ and told him that his country would soon become a monarchy, he would certainly have reacted most vigorously, blaming us for ignoring Roman tradition and mentality. Monarchy, a return to the authoritarianism of Tarquinius Superbus, out of the question. Yet Caesar already loomed beyond the horizon. Subsequently, if we had a chance to meet with one of his descendants in the year 260 after Christ, and told him of his ancestors' indignation about our naivete and our arrogance, he certainly would have shrugged his shoulders. And now, we might ask? Now? We are still a republic. Look at signs everywhere declaring Senatus Populesque Romanus, a monarchy, As among Orientals and barbarians, out of the question. But you have an emperor. Haha, imperator means general, and there have always been generals in republics. Yet a few years later, Diocletian, the Imperator Augustus, had a golden crown put on his head and demanded proskinesis, the kneeling approach to his person. Then, even the most stupid Romans realized that the Republic had gone the way of all flesh. Tacitus, indeed, had suspected it long before. There are still outstanding thinkers who have a deep respect for the monarchical order, for rational as well as sentimental motives. Yet even the rationalist has to take the psychological factor into account, or he would cease to be a realistic rationalist. As a matter of fact, the increasing democratization of Western civilization has fostered monarchophile thinking, although only on a high level. Thus, it is not surprising that Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, declared monarchy the best form of government, but, since no descendants of David survived, the aristocratic constitution of Venice should be studied in the planning of a Jewish state, whereas democracy, as the worst type of rule, was to be strictly avoided. History is already telling us how right he was. This introduction is necessary to understand the relationship between monarchy and war, and between monarchy and warfare. However, we are limiting ourselves here to the Christian monarchy in our civilization and not discussing some abstract form of monarchy. Bear in mind that arche is not Kratos. We must remember the words of Nicolas Gomez de Villa, who wrote that without Christianity and antiquity as their background, Europeans would be nothing but pale-faced barbarians. Nor should we forget that war is a calamity to be avoided, one of the many results of our imperfections caused by original sin, even if soldiers, by and large, play a positive role in the New Testament. Many of our saints have fought in battles, from St. Francis to St. Ignatius. Still, eliminating, or at least limiting war should be one of our goals. 2. The First Enlightenment produced the French Revolution, the great historical revival of democracy, a sadistic orgy in which divine marquis played the leading role both intellectually and personally. Here is not the place to portray the revolution's horrors, which were revealed to a broader public only in the years preceding its 200th anniversary in 1989. But in order to explain its effects on war and the methods of warfare, it is necessary to highlight its character and role in history. The French Revolution attempted to bring liberty and equality under a common denominator, something Goethe argued only charlatans would promise. Equality, indeed, can be established only by way of some form of slavery, just as a hedge can be kept only by way of constant trimming. In this perverse competition between liberty and equality, the latter naturally won out. Robespierre, before being dragged to Notre Chère Mère la Guillotine, had planned to put all Frenchmen into one uniform and all French women into another. He also wanted to eliminate all church steeples as undemocratic, since they were taller than all other buildings. With its ideal of equality, democracy's revival from antiquity was closely connected with nationalism, a term most Europeans equated with what Americans might call ethnicism, not to be confused with racism, which is not a linguistic cultural concept, but a biological one. The basic drive is the craving for sameness, the twin of equality. Whatever is the same is also equal, although it is not necessarily true the other way around. After 1789, differences became suspect and were to be rejected and eradicated. The traditional outlook of our culture, indeed, was vertical. God the Father in heaven, the Holy Father in Rome, the king is the father of the fatherland, and the father is the king in the family. In the lands of the Reformation, the monarch, not the Pope, was the head of the church. Connected with the fathers were the mothers, from the Regina Coeli down to the queens and the various matriarchs. Following the Revolution, the new order was increasingly flattened until it became horizontal. Of course, the people as such could not rule. Rather, majorities could rule over minorities, so numbers assumed immense importance. Even truth became a matter for majorities, so the bigger majority, the truer the right answer. The ideal was the consent, the affirmation by the majority, which in its ultimate form achieves a totality. Hence we see the totalitarian root of democracy, which stands for the politicization of the entire people. Even the children, although not allowed to vote, are now educated in that direction. It was obvious that the new order could tolerate no estates, and soon the demand arose to eliminate social differences based on wealth and income, as well as those based on birth. In 1794, the popular ire also turned against the rich, and some were guillotined for just that reason. Needless to say, the new horizontalism was in conflict with the Christian tradition, which emphatically does not stand for equality. In the French schoolbooks, one can read La terreur était terrible mais grand. The terror was terrible but great, which in view of our bottomless human stupidity, one might someday even say about German National Socialism and Russian International Socialism. Most of our contemporaries assume that the victims of the guillotine were largely degenerate aristocrats, and the final benefits of the revolution were greater than the damages or losses the French suffered. Yet, only a few years before the celebration of its 200th anniversary in 1989, a flood of well-documented books came out which tore the mask away from the face of that godless event. Already in 1986, French deputy Bernard Antony warned the European Parliament in Strasbourg not to celebrate 1789, since it had bred national and international socialism. At about the same time came the revelations of Francois Furet, Simon Schama, and above all, Reynaud Scherer, about whose terrifying volume Professor Jean Meyer wrote that the worst and most nauseating atrocities could not even be mentioned. We are told that in the sadistic orgy, pregnant women were squeezed out in fruit and wine presses, mothers and their children were slowly roasted to death in bakers' ovens, and women's genitals were filled with gunpowder and brought to explosion. We cannot continue to dwell on these unspeakable horrors and should not be surprised that Sade was involved, since his pornographic writings contained long philosophical and anti-religious passages. The infamies and cruelties of the French Revolution were of such a low nature that the national and international socialists seem humanitarians in comparison. The 1989 celebrations of the French Revolution concentrated unilaterally on the Declaration of Human Rights in the shadow of the guillotine, and did not even mention the fall of the Bastille with its most unsavory details. The invention of the guillotine was psychologically a step in a new direction, the mechanization of swift murder. Yet the French Revolution left behind something much worse than the guillotine because it was permanent, a radical change in the nature of wars, which made this human calamity still more expensive as well as intensive, the levée de masse, conscription. 3. The social pyramid in a new horizontalism was now upturned, and quantity, not quality, had its day. Everybody had the same rights, a truly microscopic share in decisions, effective only if it were part of a majority, but also the same obligations. One could vote for a representative, but, in turn, a male had the duty to defend his country, or to participate in its aggressions, which might mean drudgery in barracks, captivity, wounds, mutilation, or even death, a bad deal indeed. The draftee almost ceased to be a real person as he was dragged out of his privacy and became an individual, the meaning of which is only the last indivisible part of a collective whole. Hippolyte Taine described the results of this return to the stage of primitive tribes with these ringing words, taking from his Origine de la Français contemporaine. One puts in the hands of each adult a ballot, but on the back of each shoulder a knapsack, with what promises of massacre and bankruptcy for the 20th century, with what exasperation of ill will and distrust, with what loss of wholesome effort, but what a perversion of productive discoveries, accompanied by what an improvement in the means of destruction, by what recoil towards the inferior and unhealthy forms of the old combative societies, by what a backward step towards egoistic and brutal instincts, towards the sentiments, manner, and morality of ancient cities and barbaric tribes, we know all too well. One of the most immediate and degrading consequences of general military service in time of war was the indoctrination of the draftees. They were in the vast majority innocent, and largely even unwilling, civilians whose enthusiasm for fighting and killing was limited. They were, therefore, taught to hate the enemy, degraded to the point of wickedness and stripped of all virtue. This had been difficult in previous ages when soldiers were men, gentlemen as well as ruffians, who loved to fight and offered their services to anybody who led and paid them well. Prince Eugene of Savoy had vainly offered his services to France, but ended up as the glorious military hero of the Habsburgs. The same happened finally to Baron Gideon Loudon, born in Livonia, but of Scottish origin, whose father was an officer in the Swedish services. Loudon, however, served first in the Russian army, and then offered his experience to Frederick II of Prussia. Rebuffed, Loudon joined the largely Austrian army of the Holy Roman Emperor and defeated Frederick in battle. As late as the mid-19th century, the vast majority of recruits had scant education, mass illiteracy prevailed for generations, and had to serve long stretches in the army, frequently 3, sometimes 4 years. Those who had bachelor's degrees, aged 18 to 19 years, served only 1 year, received a commission, and became reserve officers. The idea was to have trained soldiers under arms, as well as in the reserve capacity, periodically called to maneuvers. The loss of time was considerable. Yet if one major power adopted that system, it forced other countries on the same continent to keep from being outnumbered to do exactly the same. And since the European monarchies had painfully experienced the numerical superiority of the French armies in the Napoleonic Wars, and as constitutional monarchies were drifting into the democratic cauldron, they too were now victims of a phenomenon called militarism, resulting in the armed horde. England, relying on its splendid isolation, was an exception to the rule, but the United States, politically already a victim of the French school, during the war between the states drafted not only its citizens, but also foreigners on its soil. Although they could not vote, they earned money. Thus, cash was redeemed with blood. Voluntary military service, however, is a different matter. On a lower level, it might rely on a desire to fight. On a higher one, the fascination of army life. And on the highest, the wish to defend one's country or to bring to life a great ideal. In the book from which we quoted Taine, American author Hoffman Nickerson writes, "During the last century and a half, civilization has recreated the armed horde. Previously a rarity, it has become the accepted instrument of any great military effort. It has not, however, come alone. Exactly 150 years ago, in 1789, shortly after the United States had sought to protect itself against democracy by their federal constitution, the French Revolution began. From that time to our day, democratic ideas have come to dominate politics, just as the mass army has dominated war. It is the thesis of this book that the two are inseparably connected with each other, and with a third thing, barbarism." 4. The fact that the monarchs appeared in military uniforms and figured prominently as heads of the army also symbolized the 19th century compromise of monarchy with democracy. The horizontal identitarian order assumed an increasingly national character, and the general tendency moved towards the ethnically unified state. We faced pan-Germanism, pan-Italianism, the Risorgimento movement, even pan-Slavism, which transcended minor ethnic boundaries. Hand in hand with this evolution, we see in the Germanic and Slavic areas the rise of collective gymnastic movements, cultivating a violent nationalistic spirit and manifesting itself in gigantic synchronized performances. This physical training also implied a paramilitary aim to impress the public with numbers. Undoubtedly, we have here one of the psychological roots of National Socialism. The communists too loved synchronized, uniformed mass performances. Horizontalism asserted itself visually. This is part of the 19th century's still mixed transformation. The new ideal, the ethnically uniform state, is more in harmony with militarization for the development of parliamentary institutions than is the ethnically mixed state. Mark Twain has given us an account of the parliamentary life in Vienna, and John Stuart Mill has insisted that democracy is problematic in its multilingual state. No wonder, since totalitarian institutions need linguistic uniformity. Added to this is the fact that the ethnic majority, through its party or parties, seeks to rule democratically, but not in a liberal way, over the minorities. Multilinguality creates enormous difficulties in a parliament as well as in an army. Hence, we observe the hostility of the French Revolution towards the use of non-French languages in the Republic. The rise of democracy and of ethnic nationalism went in synchromesh. These two horizontal mass movements easily combined in the name of the Demos. It is significant that the armed forces of the Red German Democratic Republic were the conscripted and ideologically drilled National Volksarmee, the National People's Army, in whose name the term people appears in two forms. Yet when the monarchist nobleman Charles de Gaulle proposed to the socialist Léon Blum to transform the French army into an armée du métier, a purely professional army consisting of volunteers, his plan was immediately rejected as a rightist undemocratic trick. Such an army could be easily mobilized against the people and might develop an esprit de corps, which would be fully undemocratic. 5. We spoke already about the indoctrination of draftees, which naturally becomes important in a time of war. An even greater evil is the fact that, since the recruits are taken from the population at large, the people itself has to be indoctrinated, in other words, made to hate the enemy collectively. For this purpose, modern governments invoke the support of the mass media, which then inform the populace about the evil of the enemy, with little or no regard for the truth. The attack stresses the wickedness and inferiority of the hostile nation and the evil deeds committed by its armed forces, which consists of cowards, a low breed recruited from the fiendish people. In the First World War, the Western Allies, being more democratic, were also more skilled in organizing collective hatreds. Taking advantage of the stupidity of the masses everywhere, they could print almost anything, and even the silliest accounts, for instance, that German soldiers cut the hands off Belgian babies, were readily believed. Louis Raymakers, a Dutchman in the service of the Allies, produced incredibly nauseating etchings depicting atrocities committed by the German army. One of the worst showed a naked French girl crucified and spat upon by bespectacled, unshaven German soldiers. Nothing like it was manufactured by the Central Powers. In a memorable book, Georges Bernanos described the idiocies of French war propaganda of the period. According to Bernanos, the French were told that the German bodies in the battlefield had a worse stench than those of the French, and that the Germans were ridiculous cowards who would not dare to interrupt the cozy life of the French poilus in their trenches. It was deceitful propaganda of the worst kind. Yet, during the French mutinies of 1917, entire battalions were decimated, i.e., every 10th man was executed. The war, therefore, was not so entertaining or cozy at all. Naturally, World War I was no longer a cabinet war between monarchs, but already what the Germans call Völkerkrieg, a war between nations, at least up to 1917, when the Russian monarchy fell and made America's entry politically feasible. Then it became an ideological crusade to make the world safe for democracy, as it happened at the end of the 18th century, when France challenged Europe ideologically. It was interesting to see how tensions were different on the two fronts, East and West. In the East, until 1917, it was still a fight among three emperors, which was the reason why the old style there somehow survived and continued on a higher level. It was still a war between gentlemen, a fact evident not only at the front, but also evident in the homelands. In Russia, craftsmen and tradesmen among the prisoners were often released, and until the Bolsheviks took over, they earned money very nicely. Enemy aliens were jailed in Britain, France, Italy, and Germany, but not in Austria.
I would stop there since there's only 8. There's only 8 chapters.
Yeah, I think that's a good spot.
Yeah, this is a good spot to stop.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me close up the tab. Okay, wow. Well, what do you guys think?
That was interesting. How I had no idea. Like, I knew the French Revolution was batshit crazy. I hadn't like gunpowder into women's genitals.
I mean,
Holy
wine
fuck.
presses on pregnant women.
No,
I mean,
was
even just rereading that, because I read it earlier today, the whole thing, like, man, that is rough reading.
First time I heard it, I was in the gym mid-rep, and I had literally decided to drop the weights and go, I'm going to sit here for a moment and kind of just sink, because that was, it's rough.
Yeah, great reading, Einkaf, by the way.
Oh yeah, very, very well done. It was incredible.
In case anyone doesn't know, Notre chère mère la guillotine, which Einkaf read earlier, translates to "Our dear mother the guillotine," which is what Robespierre referred the guillotine as.
Yeah, these guys.
There's a lot
like
about the
beyond
mindset.
evil.
Yes.
Yeah. One of Ledin had a quote, and it was I'm gonna butcher it, but like the average man blames all the problems in World War II. The intelligent man blames it all on World War I. The truly educated man blames it all on the French Revolution.
Yeah. I was just about to like make that point. Like, holy shit! Like, I tweeted out during this that, wow, the French Revolution was like way more evil than Stalin. Yeah, I mean, they make the Bolsheviks look tame.
I mean, that's what he says. It makes the international socialists look like humanitarians, It's just insane.
Yeah.
In kind of a disgusting way, the French Revolution was really kind of before its time, because when you see it fails horribly as that kind of movement is destined to do, and it really took another couple hundred years for those ideas to sort of penetrate the general psyche as badly as they have done, that they sort of get reinvented again as we enter the 20th century and even into modern day. But you see all those origins, at least politically, there, and that we can talk more about their philosophical roots and who they were reading at that point. And the author points to Marquis de Sade as being as having a fairly outsized role in a lot of the thinking at that time.
I mean, let's also not forget that a fairly outsized role, I think, in the thinking of French intellectuals also in the 20th century. I mean, Sartre, Beauvoir, and others did defend Sade to a certain extent, as trying to defend him as an intellectual. We should read his work, stuff like that. Which fair enough. Maybe we should have a copy for it. But don't try to defend him that much. You might show your hand.
I mean, it's really telling that from like these particular details why the founding fathers passed that Alien and Sedition Act against the French. It's like, oh, that's what they were scared of. No, it's like that was why they immediately turned around and said, oh yeah, this free speech thing, fuck that, nah, we're not doing this. It's like whoa, these guys are nuts. And
I don't blame them for not getting involved. I don't blame the founding fathers of America for not getting involved in the French Revolution.
Yeah,
I don't know a lot about it, but a little bit I didn't hear about like first time I ever really heard about the French Revolution was on from Ben Shapiro on like some show he was doing about how it was the reverse version of the American Revolution, and that's why it's bad. But he didn't go into detail for good reason, I'm guessing. But it's pretty fucked up.
Yeah, I have the propaganda. No, I was just saying I have the propaganda version of the French Revolution fairly well known to me because it was given to me at length in school. But yeah, continue on, Kath.
It's interesting because it's appropriately contrasted with the American Revolution, and in a historical sense, it really is ideologically the French Revolution is kind of the one that won out over a lot of the so much of the good in the American Revolution. Over time, as the author again pointed out, that the American Revolution tried to fight against the democratic impulses in their construction of the federal government, and ultimately it's sort of failed and given way to the French system. I also want to point out the political thinking, because I was looking up. Bulgakov mentioned the 20th century French thinkers, and Rousseau doesn't get mentioned in this, but certainly he has a profound effect both on the French Revolution and on 20th century French thought. When you look at the neo-Marxists and Marcuse and all the insanity that has grown out of that with the postmodernist movement.
Oh, and this is just a funny aside, but there's a great book on the friendship between David Hume and Adam Smith, which is one of the very few friendship between two very famous philosophers. But they were living at the same time as the French Revolution, and one of them was, at one point Hume was in France just after the Revolution, and Hume is famous for being one of the first atheist philosophers, right? And he was really an agnostic himself. So when he was at a dinner there, he was like, only a madman would be an atheist. Like, you can't know that God doesn't exist. Like, you have to admit you're at least agnostic. And at a dinner with 30 other French intellectuals, every other person there was a hardcore atheist, hardcore cult of reason guy. And he was just he himself was just shocked. He was like, I do not belong here. I need to get out now.
Yeah, that was something that's talked about a lot in my reading of "They Have Uncrowned Him" by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, because he talks about a lot how the French Revolution was hardcore atheist. It's that was a big difference between the American Revolution, where it's okay, they're nutjob Protestants, but they're rebelling because they want to be more nutjob Protestants. Whereas the French Revolution is they don't want to be religious at all. These guys are literally like Stalin and the Nazis, and the commies and the Nazis before their time. And it's clear how much it really influenced their thinking. And one thing that I kind of noticed that I hadn't put this together before, but I've seen it now because Lefebvre also talks about this in a little bit in his open letter to confused Catholics. He talks about this language issue of, hey, look, this is he made an argument that really convinced me of the Latin Mass, because before that I hadn't been convinced. And he says, hey, the reason that we all do it in one language is so that we're all on the same page about the ideas. And and the moment you start introducing new languages, that introduces sectarianism. And if you look at all of the places where we had different languages and where the Catholic Church did not enforce Latin, France being one of them, this is where you get all of the worst heresies. England being the England, and the Greek East being the others. And what this author says here, I can't pronounce his name. What he says here is that this is the part of the 19th century's mixed transformation. The new ideal, the ethnically uniform state, is more in harmony with the militarization and for the development of parliamentary institutions than is the ethnically mixed state. Mark Twain has given us an account of the parliamentary life in Vienna, and John Stuart Mill has insisted that democracy is problematic in a multilingual state. No wonder, since totalitarian institutions need linguistic uniformity. Added to this is the fact that the ethnic majority, through its party or parties, seeks to rule democratically, but not in the liberal way over the multilingual minorities. Multilinguality creates enormous difficulties in parliament as well as in an army. And when he had said that, it hit me why the Democrats are trying to push for so many new languages here in America. So this is a power play. It's like I hadn't connected that before. That just as a English speaking American from the middle class, you don't naturally think in that kind of way that I think in a different language. And I wouldn't naturally try to think about oppressing other people who speak a different language than me. It just doesn't naturally occur to me. But in my readings, this historically is not the case. And linguistic differences are a major factor. I mean, this is why we got the East-West schism. This is why we got problems with Martin Luther in Germany. Is why we got problems with the French. Why we got problems with the English.
I mean, just look up at the north in Canada. But Quebec has, always had a rebellious streak against the rest of English-speaking Canada all along because they speak French and we're a different person and we're different people. And Mises in liberalism actually notes this. I think he's coming at this from an angle of okay, defend democracy. How do we defend democracy? And he goes through a bunch of these points. He doesn't make all of Kunal Ladin's points, or else he wouldn't have defended democracy. But he's trying to, and he kind of comes to the conclusion that you can't have a multi-ethnic, multilingual democracy. You need to have separate, because or else you're going to have irreconcilable conflict. And democracy is supposed to be a conflict-solving mechanism, so you don't want to have irreconcilable conflict.
Yeah, one of the points I that always sticks out to me is the whole point about the draft, pretty much, and drafting soldiers and how the effect that had on war. It was a quantity over quality. The effect it had on the soldiers in school, and just the effect the draft had on how war was waged is really it can't be understated. It's crucial.
Go ahead.
No, continue on, Kev.
I was going to say that the psychological aspect of it is that you can't really get away with having a draft if you don't have a democracy. No one's going to put up with being conscripted to fight in the King's War. But with this idea of democracy, is suddenly you have a voice. You don't really have a voice, but you kind of pretend you have a voice, and therefore you have an obligation. And it's with funny. It, automatically, you have to have this propaganda flowing in immediately. You have to be able to convince people that this thing that you're forcing them to do is, one, the good thing to do, and two, actually their idea.
I really like how he, because this is almost another crusade I've been on lately, is against this concept of the individual, which seems to be so incredibly inhuman and toxic. Because he connects it here. He says that the draftee almost ceased to be a real person as he was dragged out of his privacy and became, in quotes, an individual. The meaning of which is only the last indivisible part of a collective whole.
It was
just the individual is just draftee. It's drafteeism.
What he described individual as being the most smallest part of a whole is just I loved it. I had to order it down. It was just it's spot on.
Yeah, because you're also removed from all mediating institutions. You're removed from from your local parish, from your family, from your friends, and you're just put in this impersonal machine as a quote unquote individual.
Yeah. It's individualism is necessarily drafteeism for that exact reason, that there's no intermediary between you and the powerful people. And that was the whole point of in the natural order, in feudalism and and just like the biblical order, you had one intermediary after another to prevent exactly something like this from taking place. And by liberalism trying to flatten out all of these hierarchies, which is another thing he talks about, you get rid of all of these intermediary institutions who could have defended you.
And very much by design. I think that a lot of the point, like you mentioned, the French Revolutions of being a very, very secular is not even the right word. I mean, it is explicitly anti-religious. And like all of these, like every anti-religious movement, it ends up being its own religion. And so you replace the institutions of the church, like when Andrew talks about, why is the Mass in Latin a good idea? Well, we don't have the Mass anymore, but we need to standardize our own language so that reason can become our God, so that the state can become our God. And so explicitly the goal becomes to get rid of all these institutions because we've redefined man in terms of the society. Like the individual is what you are. You are defined in terms of your role in that state. And so any intermediary only serves to reduce your role qua citizen. You are less able to be a tool of the state if you have these institutions that can mediate that interaction.
Mm-hmm. I would say I really like. It was very early on. I think it was the first paragraph. We talked about how Western civilization. I can't remember who he quoted, but it was like Western civilization rests on two men falsely convicted, falsely killed by the popular widows around him, a philosopher and the son of God.
Yes,
I've made that point before in defense of Socrates. A lot of people mock Socrates as being a loser for choosing to go to his death, but I defend that. And I think he brings it up here, and Peter Creed also brings this up. Like Western civilization is built upon Socrates and Jesus. And it's just the parallel between them interesting.
Yeah, I never put that together before, but he's right, and it's really interesting because he like two or three, like 4 or 5 paragraphs later, he says that bear in mind, arche is not Kratos. Arche means ruler, means you're applying rules, it's law and order, whereas Kratos means strength. That's like so literally means that democracy means strength of the people. And so it's like literally you're ruling by barbarianism and brute force. Democracy literally means like brute force of the people, and like and that's not a that's like definition of lawlessness. And like I hadn't realized that in the definition itself, it literally means a lawlessness and barbarianism. Yeah. And so when you connect it to like because I've made that point before that democracy killed the savior. And I hadn't quite connected it to before that, like, it like killed Socrates too, was like the other, major founder of Western civilization, because like the whole Christian idea is like a kind of a hybrid of like the Jewish mythology and the Greek mythology, or I should say Greek philosophy, I should say.
Yes.
And particularly Aristotelian and Platonic. And if you are a Christian at all, you are presuming certain philosophies of the Greeks, and like Platonism and Aristotelianism.
Yeah, you're building upon it with revelation, really.
Yes.
He's let's call him Leden. It's one of those guys that every time I read him, I always find something new, because he's just absolutely incredible. I mean, he's the fact that I found out about him because I think it was who was it? Radical Liberation. Ryan Tennessee reviewed his book, and then I looked more into him. Like, this guy gets it. Like the fact that Yarvin brings him up. Like he's Hopper, Yarvin. He's influenced a lot of people, and he's not talked about a lot. We're saying because he is just incredible.
I think it's because of his name.
It might be. It might also be. I think this actually might be a more pertinent reason is that he's admittedly he admits it. He doesn't hide it. He's very Catholic. Whereas Hoppe is an agnostic and that appeals to the reactionist blogosphere, for example, rather than a straight-up Thomist, a straight-up Catholic Thomist,
And he's a monarchist in an age, like as he fully admits, where monarchism is not really, is sort of, people sort of give you he died in 99, I think it was. He was 90 years old or something like that. But throughout the 20th century, the idea that, monarchy is probably the best system would be, even among libertarian thinkers, is kind of would raise some eyebrows.
And it's the quote right there to tie into that really struck me was when he quoted Goethe about he who cannot give account of the last 3,000 years rests in darkness, inexperienced though he lives day to day. Like that one is like, I'm so stealing that.
It's such a good quote.
'Cause,
And
like,
especially when you start
everything-
reading about his propaganda part later, and you start saying, "Oh yeah, all these propaganda scandals in the war ones, like they were accusing Germans of cutting the hands off of babies." Like, where have we heard propaganda like that in the last 20 years? And if you had that knowledge of history, if you could appreciate, oh yeah, this is something we've seen before, and it's ultimately the fault of the French Revolution. It's like, okay, yeah, the historical blindness we have, and that someone that is well studied as he is, really reveals that we there's nothing new under the sun, at least in terms of the influence of democracy and
I mean, this
the
is one
Enlightenment.
of the big points I've been trying to write about lately. About I'm going to publish an article with Austro-Thomism on this one eventually about the state's role in spreading schism. And like if you look at all of first millennium politics, when you look at it through like a Machiavellian Burnhamite lens, it all makes so much more sense. Like, oh, this is literally all political footballs.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like all of these theological disputes, they're real theological disputes, but they're being blown up into these they're making mountains out of what would otherwise be molehills, and and they're using this as excuses for war, basically. And if you like all of these stuff about Aryan schisms and all that, these were all excuses for war between Africa and the Italian peninsula, basically. And so when I'm going through issues like the filioque and all that, and I start seeing that oh, this is literally a non-issue. Maximus the Confessor said that this was a non-issue in the 6th century, and literally 5 centuries later, this is still a thing. They're oh, because it's political. They're the Greek, the Byzantine emperor is trying to use this as a political football against the Franks.
Yeah. Hey, real quick, before we get going, Einkath has to dip out, so Einkath, real quick, give us your plugs.
Sure. So at Einkath on Twitter, AnarchoCatholic.substack.com. Just put an article on atheism the other day, and writer for Austro-Thomism. And I think that article got cross-posted or will be cross-posted very shortly.
I haven't posted it yet. I'm still waiting for the final draft revisions.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so that'll be popping up very shortly. Sorry to have to dip, but have a good conversation, guys. I'm looking forward to doing part 2 later.
Absolutely.
All right.
See you, man.
See ya.
I think when we do part 2, we should definitely trace over a few of our steps first, and maybe read the the preceding 2 or 3 chapters before we do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But to this point about politics, influencing religion for basically 2,000 years now, it's if you are not reading history in this political lens of who's trying to take power from who, you are not informed. It's and it's and once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's the rest of history makes so much more sense when you read it that way. And this idea that you basically live in darkness, I just oh my god, it's just that one is it's so perfectly worded.
Yeah, Scruden has a similar phrase, I think, where there's an interview of him where he says most people walk through life as if through unillumined corridors until they meet their demise. It's something like that, where they know nothing of what's going on around them. They don't really know what's ahead. They don't really remember what's behind. And at one point, they just fall over. It's a great, very black-pilled quote, but it's very, very good, very much in the same vein. Because Scruden has defended monarchy, by the way. I only found this out recently, but he's also defended monarchy as comparative democracy.
Nice. I really enjoyed his point. I think I found a quote here. Is here it is. God the Father in heaven, the Holy Father. He's talking about the traditional outlook of our culture. Culture indeed was vertical. God the Father in heaven, the Holy Father in Rome, the King is the father of the fatherland, and the father is the king of the family. And the lands of Reformation, the monarch, not the Pope. Which I really like that he brings it up. I think at one point I think it's kind of ignored when talking about Reformation was how involved kings were and the kings were at a time and how involved kings have been in religions of Protestantism. Which it seems like he knew that, and it seemed to be a known thing in the past, but not really talked about now. Yeah. I know Andrew talks about it, so I'm very thankful he does that. I really enjoy seeing those kind of
we sometimes remember that the Queen of England is technically the head of the English Church, of the Church of England, although she doesn't exercise that position, and she probably should with an iron fist, because she can. You know, she can't really do democracy. She doesn't have power there. She only has symbolic power. Like, they would shut her down and strip her crown away if she tried to do anything. But she could, you know, rule the Church of England, I think, like, fairly well if she wanted to. But
I'd be
she
a fan of
doesn't.
that.
She's abdicated that responsibility, I think.
It's the same.
Well, I mean, this is another thing you see with, you know, like Caesaropapism in the first millennium, where you would get one, you know, the emperor would try to put bishops and patriarchs in power, and invariably he would choose people who were not theologians and would abuse the office. And you saw this a lot when the Muslims got in charge of Constantinople, where they would literally just publicly auction off the office of the patriarch of Constantinople. and, like, literally, just a public auction for the office. And, you know, and you get, like, this is how we got, like, some of the worst patriarchs in history, where they were just secular people with no authority. So the Queen of England, she totally could exercise that authority. But it's like, I can only imagine how she's gonna do that, given the historical precedents that have already been set in the first millennium with that.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's like what I see here. And by the way, like right there, as where he says, as a rationalist and a liberal, in the worldwide sense rather than in the American sense, which is really, really good to put that in really good to clarify that one.
Yes.
He says, I am also a monarchist who realizes that monarchy combined with Christianity and antiquity was responsible for the rise and flowering of Western civilization. And like, this is like been like the biggest revelation for me lately as like a Mises GOP monarchist who like really wants to have a private property monarchy society like within my lifetime, is like, oh, you need to tie this, you know, it can't just be you're trying to get a bunch of libertarians or corporations to move there. That's not going to work. You need to be like getting all of like the Catholic monks and nuns to move there first. Like, your earliest adopters needs to be like the Catholic Church. They're like, God, how am I going to do that one?
He makes a point very strongly that it's Christian monarchies. And in fact, at one point, you know, he has this imaginary dialogue of two Roman citizens, one in like before Christ, one after Christ. And they make the point like, monarchies as among Orientals and barbarians? Ha! It's like, no way. But yeah, it needs to be Christian monarchies. It can't be something else.
Yeah.
And like where he says, oh yeah, we don't have a king, we have an imperator, which means general.
Yeah, we've always had generals. Even republics have generals. How can you object to that? Which is also a very good idea of like Yarvin's conception that power is very good at hiding itself. It's like, yeah, of course we have a general, right? It's like, yeah, we're a democracy. Of course we have like a deep state and a civil service that's completely entrenched. Like, that's natural. Like come on. That doesn't mean they hold power. Like, get over yourself.
Sure, Diocletian has a gold crown on his head.
He's just a general, though. Come on.
Exactly. It's just like, I don't know. This is perfectly summing up like a lot of like what I've been thinking through personally for the increasing democratization of Western civilization has fostered monarchophile thinking, although only at the highest level. And I'm thinking like that might be a little bit dated. Like that sentence right there, that might be a little bit dated. This is
he was writing this, I think, of 80 years old too. So I'll cut him some slack for that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's like, I think this is like, we're seeing a turn in history right now where, I think like I saw an article about Yarvin today from on some, I think it was Vanity Fair, maybe.
Yes, he got
something was written about him on Vanity Fair, I think.
Yeah, and I think that they were saying, hey, that like Peter Thiel is putting a crap load of money behind these guys over here. And I'm like, yeah, because I think that's the course of history, and Thiel is a guy who would know that. Yeah, and he's the sort of guy who would understand that and understand where to put the money. And so I think that when we see Tucker, when we see Tucker and Yarvin talking, it's like and we see like Tucker using Yarvin's ideas and words like cathedral all the time.
Yes,
I really think this is like about to go like hardcore mainstream.
I was on a podcast with 2-Bit Jason and Carlos from Los Libertinos like 4 days ago. Yeah, we talked about Yavin, friend of Fed, and it was like, what's going to happen when Yavin blows up, pretty much. Because Jason's point is it's only a matter of time before Yavin ends up on Lex Friedman or Joe Rogan show. Like, he's going to end up on one of the bigger ones.
It's a matter of time.
A bubble's going to pop, and we're going to see a lot of new people. A lot of people are going to claim to be a monarchist and never read anything, but this is what listen to Yavin. I'm happy for him. Bring him in, but it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, it's gonna be weird. It's gonna be a weird transitional like preference cascade period where people are like, oh no, this thing's like way better, but they're not gonna really know how to approach it. They're gonna have a very surface level understanding of it. One thing you guys just talked about this quote, but as a rationalist and a liberal, I am a monarchist, is an insane red pill for a normie reading this and with having no acquaintance with any of the subject matter and someone saying I am a liberal, I am a rationalist, ergo, I am a monarchist is such a great sentence. Just a great declaration of position.
I think he wants to describe himself as an arch liberal who would
an arch liberal of the extreme right, which is what Nick Land also describes himself.
I love it.
He used that exact phrase. He said, I take my position from Kunal Ladin. I am an arch liberal of the extreme right.
Yeah, I'm super excited to continue to cover Ledin because I wanted to cover him for a while now, but my problem with him is that his ideas are so good. Anything I can't condense it. There's no way I can really condense his ideas well.
This is already condensed, really.
Yeah, it's great. I really
he talks about horizontalism, the making of all hierarchies vertical, not vertical. Sorry, horizontal. The equaling of everyone. How this is explicitly, at least in its origin, not nowadays perhaps, or nowadays it hides it, but in its origins it's explicitly anti-religious and anti-Christian, specifically, and it tries to, lack of mediating institutions. I don't think he really gets into that. He sort of implies it here. I think he has other places where he talks more about this, but it's the making of everyone equal as well, and using that to level out Christian feelings and essentially Christian religion really from the populace, and also using, if you have a mass army, you need propaganda. You can't, if you don't have a professional army, you need them to be convinced that this is like a war for extermination, basically. If you lose this, your wives will be raped, your children will be killed, it's over if you lose this, basically. Whereas if it's a professional army, as Hoppe also talks about this in Democracy, God, that failed quite a bit. You can have it doesn't really matter. It's a war between two people with usually some scoundrels, some gentlemen in the army, and it's a war for land and who's going to pay the taxes. And usually, up until maybe the Reformation or something, your religion was not really in danger. After the Reformation, there was some Catholic Protestant conflicts. I will admit, quite a bit actually. But up until that point, and even after that point, up until I think he says the 18th century is the height of civilized warfare before the French Revolution. So up until that point, you have this very civilized way, or the ever increasing civilizing process of war making, and then it just all comes crashing down. Because the mindset, the political structure, the political formula, essentially, of the population, to use Mosca's term that Yarvin stole, is completely different.
I can't remember if it was in this one or somebody else. He talked about he once did a debate on on war with some American liberal type, and the guy objected to the way he said the word a gentleman's war. I can't imagine what a gentleman's war would be. He's like, well, of course you can. You can't. You're not a gentleman. Of course you can't imagine that.
Yeah, it's not in your experience. You don't know what it would look like.
Yeah, it's it's really. I sent this to a few people who I knew were anti-war, but kind of not they're anti-war, but not monarchists. I sent this to them yo guys, if you should listen to this. This is I think a lot of them say anti-war, but not monarchists. This is a good text for them to read because it's very hey, wars were fought less and better under monarchies, and that's a very important thing to keep in mind.
These were not wars of annihilation.
Yeah,
which is the point he's making here is that under democracy, when you have when the individual is kind of a fancy term for draftee, it's these are wars of annihilation. These are wars of annihilation.
Yeah.
That is not something you ever got under monarchy.
The people are the government. Who do you target? You target the government.
Exactly.
It's
and you would try to keep if you were trying to conquer the territory, it was like one for security reasons, or two because like you actually wanted the wealth that it has, so you wouldn't go in and try to destroy the wealth, which is the people. And like that was the thing you would try to avoid if you could. And whereas in democracy, you don't give a damn. And this is where you get like the like Napoleon running through. And this was a like wow, like that, like the French army was way more barbaric than the Prussians that they were facing.
Yes.
I don't have any more notes. Anybody have any final thoughts? Because we're running up on an hour.
Let's see. I don't know. I think it's interesting that he mentions that really a lot of books and articles came out before the 200th anniversary of French Revolution, sort of giving away the lie of the whole thing. It was interesting that it was only then that really a lot of, I don't know if serious historical revision was carried out from the sort of flowery picture that had been painted of it. I find that interesting, and that's possibly one of the reasons why we're, part of the political formula of our age is that democracy is good, and this is the original mythos of democracy is the French Revolution. Not so much in America, I'll grant you, but certainly in Europe. In America, I think the current regime, I think Yarvin has made this point, the current regime, starts or sees its origin as the civil rights era. This is the era where now we've rectified all the wrongs of the past. And before this, there was, what was it? The New Deal, FDR's New Deal. And those are basically the starting points of the current regime. Before that, it's like a whole different thing that's sort of morphing into this monster.
Well, it's interesting now that all the current regime views like the Civil Rights Act, which was like notably about getting the blacks the vote, getting the women the vote, and stuff like that. And now we're undermining, when stuff like this comes out, it undermines the idea of a vote at all. Yes. So it's like literally like the founding myth is what's at stake here for the current regime. That, hey, that actually, none of those were good things. Voting itself is not a good thing. And, what's a good thing is property. What's a good thing is monarchy, which is property. And, and what's a good thing is religion, not separation of church and state. And that in order to have a prosperous Western civilization, you need to go back to the God that was succeeding before the usurper destroyed it.
Yeah, and if I guess when I was a kid, I remember thinking separation of church and state didn't mean that they weren't involved at all. I remember thinking it was like, like very just different power spheres that interact with each other. It's like, no. The conception of the modern regime is, they shouldn't interact at all, so much that you see a recent example. People are getting pissed that Nancy Pelosi, a Catholic who should be subject to the authority of the Catholic Church, is being denied communion for the obvious sin of supporting abortion, and not just like, in her heart of hearts, but publicly, and trying to make it legal and accessible, which is literally against the catechism of the Catholic Church. It's there, like civil authorities should make laws prohibiting abortion wherever they can.
Yeah, it's been a weird week on Twitter seeing people who don't know anything about Catholic Church. Like Whoopi Goldberg's post, but this is not your job. Telling the Archbishop, it's like, this isn't your job. This isn't what you're supposed to do. It's like, that's literally his job. It's literally in the job description. You don't know. Shut up.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
but like this, it's seeing stuff like this start to go. I think we're hitting a turning point. This stuff is going mainstream now, and I think these ideas are like, it's good that we have this Austro-Thomism show here. I really think this is going to get to be a big one. So.
I hope so.
Thanks for having me here, guys.
It's the bomb. Bulgakov, go and give you plugs, and Andrew give you plugs after Bulgakov. And
sure. I'm at available username on Twitter. I should probably include it in my name here next time so that you guys can type correctly. I write for Austro-Thomism. I'm currently finishing an article. I just need to add some concluding thoughts to it. It'll be published soon, and that's about it for my plugs. I don't write anywhere else or am available anywhere else at the moment.
Okay. Andrew, what are your plugs?
You can find me at Popular Liberty _ on YouTube. On Twitter, you can find me at Popular Liberty on YouTube. I'm probably going to change the name to Politically Catholic, within the next few weeks. So if you're listening to this sometime in June, you might want to look for me under Politically Catholic. And if you want to support monarchy and the idea of moving towards property, a more property-based society, support me at misesgop.org/donate. Every monthly donation, even just like $1 or $2 or $3 a month, really helps push us towards an actual property rights civilization.
And we're live on live Austro-Thomism live reading. I got Eincast, got Popular Liberty, Bulgakov. How you guys doing tonight?
I'm doing fine.
Howdy.
A little bit sick.
How are you, Caleb?
Doing good. I'm excited to read more Eric von Leden. I'm not going to even try to pronounce the middle one. I spent the day listening. I spent the day listening to Liberty and Equality again because it's such a great book. And so I'm really
I need to read that book.
Dude,
that's so actually good. Probably the best. I'd actually be curious to see Contra Gentiles go through
I have suggested it multiple times
because he is the closest to both the Thomist world, being in the Thomist world, and closest to the libertarian world, being closely associated with the Mises Institute. So he's the most palatable for both people to see the other side, I suppose.
I was talking to Grant. He wanted to. They were thinking about doing a Democracy of God at Fair, and I said it's good, but it's a lot of economics. You might like Liberty and Equality more because it's similar but more reason-based, philosophy-based, and not a little less on the economics. I know you guys aren't a fan of. So who knows? If we're lucky, we can get Grant to read it.
Philosophy is how you convince Contra Gentiles, apparently.
It very much is. No surprise there. Philosophy should be how you convince most people. Yeah, philosophy should be how you convince most people, really. Making an economic argument is usually for the engineers, for the economic engineers of the world, people who see it that way.
I just make the emotional and financial argument now. I've learned too much that philosophy, this is not how I convince most people, sadly.
Yeah. I give up trying to convince people. I tell them what I think, and if they want to agree with me, neat. If they don't, I don't care enough.
I thought you were going to say if they don't agree with you, you're going to force them.
I mean, that's the eventual plan. But right now, I don't really have any power. I have to keep it down low. But let me say the screen here, and we'll get right into this. We're gonna have Eincast do the reading again tonight because he did a great job last time. Where are we starting off again? I forgot to get on the right.
I think we're starting at 6. Where we left off last time.
There we go. Okay, 6 is up. Whenever you're ready, we'll hop right into it.
Sounds good. And again, if we need to jump in for comments, because I think this is gonna be a slightly longer reading than the last time. Let me know if I need to break it up, if I need to stop. But otherwise, I'm just going to go until someone yells at me. All right. So again, this is Eric von Leden's Monarchy and War, picking up with chapter 6. A war between entire nations developing into an ideological crusade, the word crusade has near religious implications, was bound to assume total and totalitarian features. The totalitarians could kindle the fervor of their soldiers more easily because they operated in a highly authoritarian framework. This also explains why the German army fought well in the hopelessly defensive rear action for more than 2 years between 1942 and 1945. Yet the hate propaganda of the democracies was successful. Thus, mixed with racist motives, the United States decided to put the West Coast's entire foreign as well as American population of Japanese ancestry in concentration camps, a wartime tactic developed by the British during the Boer War. There were among them U.S. citizens with only one Japanese grandparent who looked Caucasian and spoke not a word of Japanese. Likewise, after the final mass surrender of German soldiers in May 1945, they were not treated as ordinary prisoners of war who were protected by the Hague Convention, but as DEF, disarmed enemy forces, and dealt with miserably. They were starved and ultimately suffered enormous losses, possibly as many as 1 million. Indignation about the German concentration camps, however, played only a minor role in this policy because the facts about German war atrocities were largely not believed. People remembered the lies spread about the Germans during World War I. Upon entering the age of the armed horde, wars inevitably took on new forms and another character. The idea was no longer to outmaneuver the enemy and merely to win battles, but, since this is a war between peoples and ideologies, to kill as many enemies as possible, whereby wars assumed an exterminatory character. The mercenaries of the past belonged to different nationalities and, once they signed up, could be employed for different reasons and operations by their employer, or even traded to one another. He who sells himself can also be sold to somebody else. Since wars had evolved from clashes between crowned heads to conflicts between masses of people, entire nations collectively became enemies of other nations. Therefore, wars could at long last be waged against civilians, not only against beleaguered cities, but against entire populations of men, women, and children. And since technology had given us aviation, it had become possible to attack villages and cities in the hinterland of the enemy, rather than just attacking the enemy soldiers on the front lines. The French, pioneers in aviation, made a beginning in World War I by bombing a Corpus Christi procession in Karlsruhe and killing children, and the Germans followed up by dropping bombs from Zeppelins on British cities and firing artillery missiles on Paris from a distance of 80 miles. Frenchmen had to die, regardless of age and sex. This seemed all right. Europe had fallen that low. Curiously enough, it was the Third Reich, although planning aggressive wars, which desired to ban aerial warfare except on well-defined battlefronts. In 1935, the Germans, wanting a pact outlawing war on civilians in the hinterland, suggested this to Great Britain, which at that time had a Labour government. However, the offer was rejected on the ground that all efforts to humanize war would make wars more acceptable, and thus would be a blow to the noble cause of pacifism. Actually, all important British authors confirmed the thesis that in the Second World War, the aerial warfare started total war, war to the last extremity, willed and perfected by the democracies, not by the National Socialists. German attacks outside of the war zone were always retaliations. Some British authors merely shamefacedly admitted this fact. Others, Mr. Churchill above all, boasted of it. General J.F.C. Fuller stated that it was Mr. Churchill who lit the fuse which detonated a war of devastation and terrorization unrivaled since the invasion of the Seljuks. The war reached its all-time low with the destruction of Dresden, the German Florence, with a loss of 204,000 lives, and the annihilation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Although the Japanese had desperately asked for armistice conditions twice in 1945, in April through the Vatican, and in July via Moscow, the answer was only the infamous and idiotic unconditional surrender formula. The American people knew nothing about this, and during that period, not only did thousands of Japanese die in vain, but so too died innumerable American boys. The hatred generated by propaganda heated up the horizontal collective mentality to such a degree that the war in the Pacific assumed, in the words of American socialist leader Norman Thomas, the character of a military organized race riot. The racist aspect of that war achieved a very concrete expression in a memorable incident. An American soldier sent President Roosevelt a paper knife made from the thigh bone of a Japanese soldier killed in action. The president wrote him a letter of thanks and expressed his hope to get more such presents. The news reached the Japanese, whereupon Ken Harada, Japanese ambassador at the Vatican, decided to protest via Roman channels. The president then changed his mind and promised to give the knife a dignified burial. An even greater evidence of sheer barbarism appeared in the bombing of the Gestapo center in The Hague, leaving 800 Dutch dead. Even worse were the 3,500 victims of the carpet bombing of Le Havre just prior to his liberation, but after the evacuation by the Germans. De Gaulle was outraged, but German-American allies justified themselves by saying, "We really thought that the Jerrys were still in the city." Thereupon, de Gaulle hit the ceiling, butchering 3,500 Frenchmen just to get a few Germans. He went to Le Havre for their burial, heading the cortege with the clergy. Nor was there any respect for the cultural treasures of the old world. In World War I, the Germans were accused of shelling Reims Cathedral, with the excuse that observers were hidden in the spire, and having willfully burnt down parts of Louvain-Leuven before civilians had fired on their troops. But World War II was far more progressive, which means that Europe and North America had declined for the previous 200 years under populist rule, and had reached the cultural and ethical levels of Dahome's Gegle or Uganda's Idi Amin Dada. The raids over Germany were called Baedeker raids because, fearing for their safety, the Allied pilots flew very high and emptied their freight more or less in the historic centers of the cities, destroying the most beautiful buildings, but damaging industrial war production astonishingly little. The hearts of Frankfurt, Munich, Nuremberg, Hamburg, and Bremen were in shambles, but the industrial establishments surrounding them survived. Some Allied spokesmen explained that one wanted to hit the workers' dwellings, while others thought that the annihilating German Kultur destroyed Nazi arrogance. Yet that blood orgy contributed little to the Allied victory. IG Farben and other big enterprises functioned to the bitter end. One of the worst and most idiotic feats was the U.S. Army's destruction of the ancient Italian monastery of Monte Cassino. The Allies had been informed that there were no German troops inside, but since the building remained intact, a hue and cry was raised in the United States that to spare the monastery would be yielding to Roman Catholic interests at the cost of American lives. Our boys would have to die to please the Pope. Finally, the military yielded to bolster the home front. The Vox Populi should not be thwarted, and a political decision, not a military decision, was made. The old building went up in flames, thus making it safe for the Germans to occupy the ruins, whereas to defend a huge building under artillery fire would have been suicidal. Now the American soldiers faced an enemy much better entrenched and more fully protected by the rocks of the destroyed abbey. No falling walls could bury them. The Allied losses became much bigger, as did those of the poor betrayed Poles who had to fight with them, but public opinion was satisfied. The war was fought democratically. Yet, what did the American soldiers think of such irreparable losses of architectural beauty? An officer stationed near Benevento asked whether he had any misgivings, replied to an American journalist, "There's nothing what can be done about it. Italy is just lousy with clerical monuments." Most unfortunately, the Second World War had another fatal aspect, the resistance movement, enthusiastically applauded by the public of the Western Alliance. An exception has to be made for the Polish Armenia Krajowa, as well as for Jewish fighters, because the National Socialists, like the International Socialists, wanted to deprive them of their upper classes or to exterminate them altogether. With no legal armies for their defense, they had the moral right to fight for their very existence. Yet, as in other countries, the occupying army had no other means to combat these sly attackers but to take hostages and shoot them. Not completely democratized nations did not engage in such activities, and all too often, resistors were former collaborators who, sensing that the Third Reich was a sinking ship, changed sides. Obviously, the French resistance became truly active only after the collapse of the National-International Alliance. There had been a predecessor of the civilian resistance after France became a republic in 1870 in the form of the Franc-Tireurs, entirely in keeping with the rising horizontalism. One used to have no right to participate in a war without wearing the king's coat. The alternative was to sink to the level of savages. This was somewhat different in the case of the Balkans, where after 500 years of Turkish rule, the Christian tradition had been broken, and one went to war collectively, as we painfully experienced in 2 world wars. First with the nationalistic comitatus, then the ideological partisani. 7. One of the worst results of the democratization of wars was, and remains, the difficulty in terminating a war by peace, or at least by lengthy periods of peace. In a partially or fully democratic order, having fought with conscripted soldiers, one is governed largely by representatives of the people, who do not think historically, but politically. Of history, economics, cultural mentalities, and geography they know nothing. Moreover, they think personally, not dynastically. What do they have primarily in mind? The weal of their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, or the winning of the next election? Furthermore, the returning soldiers, if they have been fighting on the winning side, want to see the fruits of their suffering, so they yearn for a peace with maximum gains for their country. Mercenaries thought otherwise. They had their next job in mind. Moreover, generosity is a virtue more frequently found in the small top layers than among the masses. After all, it takes intelligence to suspect that generosity very often pays, while egotism does not. In a brilliant book, Fenelon exhorted the Dauphin, "Peace treaties are meaningless if you are the stronger one, and if you force your neighbor to sign a treaty to avoid greater evil. Then he signs in the same way as a person who surrenders his purse to a brigand who points his pistol at his throat." Yet, already in the 19th century, in which we witnessed the democratization of constitutional monarchies, we see that the warning of Fenelon was increasingly ignored. The German drive for unification and the Italian Risorgimento offered opportunities to annex entire countries and to make dynasties homeless. In this respect, the Italians made the start. The sovereigns of Modena, Parma, and Tuscany, and the Bourbons of both Sicilies had to quit. After the liberation of Schleswig-Holstein from the Danish rule by the German League, the legitimate heirs were not allowed to take over their inheritance. The situation was made worse by the outcome of the German-Prussian War of 1866, which ended with Prussia's incorporation not only of Schleswig-Holstein, but also of Hesse-Nassau, the imperial city of Frankfurt, and the Kingdom of Hanover. This was the policy of Bismarck, who had started his life as a typical Prussian conservative and devout Lutheran Christian, but became a German nationalist and a national liberal who, soon after the establishment of the German Empire, the Second Reich, initiated as a nationalistic progressivist the Kulturkampf against the Catholic Church. Yet the real break came with the end of World War I, which changed from a war between nations into an ideological crusade to make the world safe for democracy. By 1900, Europe had only two democratic republics, France and Switzerland, a form of government then represented largely by South and Central American nations enriched in 1910 and 1912 by Portugal and China. The great victory of democracy in Central Europe, even though its triumph in Russia lasted only 7 months, and the disappearance of the three emperors created a new scene. The Democrats expected to fashion the peace democratically, i.e. by the consent of the majority of the voters in the victorious nations. Of course, if we look at Wilson's 14 points, the defeated should have been expected the principle of self-determination to be applied even to them, but this lovely document had merely been bait for surrender. Since the victors were the democracies, the treaties were not treaties, but dictates which had to please the voters at home. Since these had been taught to hate the enemy, the agitated masses in reality voted for, even if indirectly, the dictates. In Britain, we had the famous khaki election, an orgy of demagoguery in which Lloyd George promised to ruin the German middle class by way of exorbitant reparations, to make Germany pay so that the pips squeak, and to hang the Kaiser. George F. Kennan stated that nearly all our evils go back to the First World War, not to the fighting, but to the outcome. I offer 4 reasons for his thesis. American intervention, which artificially prolonged the war and prevented a compromised peace. The combination of national combat with an ideological crusade that aggravated the issue. The mountainous historical, geographic, economic, and psychological ignorance of the politician who naturally, thinking only of elections, wanted to please the voters, and the people's intellectual vacuum after their emotions had been whipped up to the nth degree. The bad taste of Bismarck, who organized the celebrations for the establishment of the Second Reich in Versailles, was now imitated by those who prepared the humiliation of the German Reich in the mirror hall of the same building. There, as in the far more important dictates of Saint-Germain-en-Laye and Trianon, were laid the foundations of the Third Reich and World War II, with the admirable foresight and loving care in every detail. The Versailles Treaty did tremendous harm in Germany internally, but hardly changed the map of Europe. The destruction of the Habsburg Empire made Germany the geopolitical winner of World War I. Bordering after 1919 on only one great power, France, it was now the direct or indirect neighbor in the East of partially artificial, partly militarily invincible states. As His Magnificence Ernst Kornemann, the rector of Breslau University, pointed out in 1926, the time to take advantage of this situation would come sooner or later. It came. Hitler inherited from the authors of the Paris Suburban Treaties not only an internal situation characterized by the economic uprooting of the important social layers and the imposition of an unworkable form of government, but also a uniquely profitable geopolitical position, which was caused primarily by the division of Austria-Hungary. If Hitler had any sense of humor, he would have erected a colossal monument to Woodrow Wilson. Looking back at these happenings, John Maynard Keynes, who assisted Lloyd George at these conferences, wrote that the Carthaginian peace is not practically right and possible. The clock cannot be set back. Without setting up such strains in the European structure and letting loose such human and spiritual forces as pushing beyond frontiers and races will overwhelm not only you and your guarantees, but your institutions and the existing order of your society. One of these guarantees was the League of Nations, which Compton Mackenzie called a typist dream of the Holy Roman Empire, and which the Congress of the United States refused to join. Still, there is no doubt that general satisfaction reigned in the nations of the victors, not only among the Americans, British, French, and Italians, but also among the Czechs, Romanians, and Serbs. However, intelligent Poles, seeing their country buffeted between Germany and the Soviet Union, remained skeptical. Yet history, always immensely brutal, might have said to the defeated, since you were disloyal to your better self, to your heritage and traditions, you will serve not emperors, but exterminators in abject slavery, pitiless megalomaniacs who will force you back to another slaughter. And to the victors she would say, profiting from your huge superiority in men and wealth, you have abused your triumph and paid dearly not only with men, women, and children, but also with your worldwide prestige and possessions. Looking back to World War I, The old democratic enthusiasm for extending the great ideals of the French Revolution reappears, even at the price of enormous bloodshed, because democracy means to simple spirits freedom from rule from above or outside. When a compromise peace was in the offing, the democratic idealists went up in arms. The left hand of Wilson in foreign politics, George D. Heron, preferred even a Prussian victory to a compromise peace, which to him meant aristocracy, ruler barons, Habsburgs, and the Catholic Church, and would break God's heart, whereas even after a triumph of the Hohenzollerns, the nations still might awake after a long, baleful night to cosmic intimacy and infinite knowledge. Wilson greatly admired Heron and made him his go-between in Europe during the war, thus giving him the opportunity to torpedo the Austrian peace effort in February 1918, for it would have meant the political survival of the Habsburgs. Yet, under conscription, the lives of soldiers are of little value, since they are easily replaced. The same holds true for the rebuff suffered by the secret German right before the outbreak of the Second World War, the Halder-Beck conspiracy, and then for the rebuff during the war of their efforts through Dr. Bell, the Bishop of Chichester, who begged in vain to get the cooperation of Winston Churchill. The Germans had to sign the treaty in Versailles because the hunger blockade worked like thumbscrews. The hope for a liberal democracy in Russia had been snuffed out by the radical social democrats, the so-called Bolsheviks, and thus Russia was no longer a fit partner in a league of honor, as Wilson had greeted the rule of Alexander Kerensky. 20 years later, the new Russia, the socialist fatherland, had the delightful chance to start the Second World War jointly with the National Socialists. Had the European monarchs ever tried to enforce monarchism in the Second or Third French Republic in Brazil after the fall of the monarchy, or in Portugal in 1910? No, because there's no such thing as monarchism. Democracy, as democratism, is a Gnostic ideology hell-bent on saving the world. Monarchy is familistic. The family is something natural. It needs no philosophical impulses. It represents no secular religion. Yet, to make people happy, after one's own fashion, sometimes requires a little and occasionally even a lot of pressure. In February 1914, Mr. Wilson thought that the Mexicans would be much happier if, politically, they imitated the United States, which in turn had imitated France. This worried Sir Edward Grey, the British foreign minister. Between him and American ambassador Walter Hines Page, a curious dialogue developed. The theme was Mexican reluctance to adopt a full-fledged democracy, which the United States, after all, had fostered and abetted in Mexico even before they had supported Benito Juarez, the murderer of Emperor Maximilian. The exchange of opinions went as follows. Gray: suppose you have to intervene, what then? Page: make them vote and live by their decisions. Gray: but suppose they will not so live. Page: we'll go in again and make them vote again. Gray: and keep this up for 200 years? Page: yes. The United States will be here for 200 years, and it can continue to hoot them for that little space till they learn to vote and rule themselves. With that unsophisticated mentality, the young democracies were forced to enjoy self-government, to rave about their new republican liberty. This wording reminds one of the Napoleonic conquerors of the Tyrol and the spirit in which the suburban Paris treaties were dictated. France had drowned Europe in blood in the 1795 to 1815 period. Yet, at the Congress of Vienna, its delegates were received with great honor. The sessions and discussions were conducted in French, and France left the conference table slightly enlarged. There was no cry to hang the emperor, nor was there a public whose craving for revenge had to be satisfied. 8. Of course, it would be naive to think that wars in the truly monarchical period of our Christian history were a pleasant pastime. Wars were not infrequent, and the discipline among the mercenaries was miserable. Occupied cities had to pay contributions, the taking of booty was accepted, and marauding soldiers were a plague. It was only in the 18th century that wars had assumed a civilian character. The fact that generals belonged to noble families helped greatly. They had the right upbringing, and Europe's aristocracy was internationally related, although not to the extent of the royal imperial families. In judging the character of their enemies, they certainly were never influenced by the mass media. One cannot imagine Marlborough being moved by the editorials in London's Daily Courant, as President Kennedy was by David Halberstam of the New York Times. The monarchs, however, were not only an international, but also an interracial breed, a great advantage to nations they ruled because it gave them a certain distance from their subjects whom they could thus judge more objectively. In 1909, the only genuinely native sovereign dynasties in Europe were the Petrovic Nagyos in Montenegro, and the Karajujovics in Serbia. Certainly not the most significant or distinguished ones. The House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha ruled in Saxe-Coburg, Great Britain, Belgium, Portugal, and Bulgaria. The Holstein-Gottorps ruled in Russia, where the real Romanovs had died out with Peter II. The Bourbons ruled in Spain. The Alemannic Hohenzollerns ruled Prussia and Romania. The Nassaus ruled in the Netherlands and in Luxembourg. The Swiss-Lotharingian Habsburgs ruled in Austria-Hungary. The French Savoys ruled in Italy. And the Sonderburg-Gluckburg-Alstenburgs ruled in Denmark, Norway, and Greece. They all descended from Charlemagne and Muhammad, had a drop of Jewish blood, and from the motherline of Maria Theresia, they come from Cumanian Turk-Tartar princes. Excuse me. The Reformation raised a wall between the Catholic and Protestant families, but it was sometimes broken. Despite quarrels, wars, and denominational differences, even as late as 1870, the defeated Napoleon III dined as a prisoner with William I of Prussia and Bismarck in Wilhelmshohe Castle, where the Prussian king addressed the French emperor as Monsieur Ferré. Self-control, good manners, and generosity belonged to a monarch. Here we have to keep in mind that although the interrelationship between the monarchs was tightened in the course of centuries, they were not entirely immune to the influence of the historic developments after 1789. In other words, to democracy, socialism, nationalism, and horizontalist temptations. It is even doubtful whether Lloyd George alone was responsible for not saving the lives of the Russian imperial family. In 1917, the British refused to give them asylum. Monarchy had several great advantages. First of all, one could expect a monarch to be psychologically and intellectually prepared for his task. Considering the intellectual preparations of some leading politicians for their task, we can only throw up our hands in horror, as often their looks and their gift of gab alone got them into office. A second asset is, or rather was, their international relationships and their lack of local ties. Number 3 is the fact that they owe their position to no party, faction, interest group, estate, or class, but only, to use the words of Bossuet, to the sweet process of nature. The fourth advantage is that monarchs had the chance to act historically. In democracies where the primary task is to win elections, and where instability with nicely spaced changes is even a matter of pride, a constructive foreign policy is well nigh impossible. Monarchs were in office until they died, at which time they left their realms to their sons or nearest relatives. They could act historically, not politically, in a way without a time limit, hence their various political testaments. This has been aptly demonstrated by Professor Hans Hermann Hoppe in an essay which likens the democratic procedure to a small child wanting his wishes fulfilled immediately and protests in tears if there is a delay or a negative reaction. A monarch, as a member of a dynasty, can plan for a distant future, even for generations. Yet it would be most erroneous to believe that a return to monarchy, even a Christian monarchy, would solve all of our problems. Recall the praise of the great monarchist Charles Maurras bestowed on this form of government: le moindre mal, le possible du bien, the least evil, the possibility of something good. Still, a monarch as member of a dynasty can plan for the distant future, even for generations. In our times in which the globe has been transformed into an immensely complex scene, the abyss between the Skita and the Scindia, the actual knowledge of voters and candidates compared with the necessary knowledge, unavoidably widens all the time. And since the required knowledge among those active or passive in the democratic process is minute, only sentiments, sympathies, and antipathies, pleasing and unpleasant factors, are now effective. Hence, democracies act like rabbits, jumping in all imaginable directions into unwanted wars, idealistic crusades, and undesirable, fatal peace arrangements. From childhood, monarchs prepared for their duties. They inherited the profession as traditionally as craftsmen did theirs. The son of a tailor became a tailor, and so forth. These tailors produced sometimes bad garments, occasionally excellent ones, but usually passable ones. So too with monarchs. Yet dentists, lawyers, cobblers, farmers, or plumbers could not have produced any clothes whatever, only monstrosities. Hence the decline of Europe, already lasting more than 200 years, which also means that one should not forget the already mentioned fact that monarchy compromised with democracy during the 19th century, and thus acquired merely a psychological role in the 20th. Wars, however, are undesirable under all circumstances. The ideal solution, a present a dream without any hope of realization, would be a board of Christian monarchs controlling the globe, aware of the fact that wars today, thanks to the developments of technology, chemistry, physics, and biology, have assumed a suicidal character. They menace the survival of all mankind, which, so far, has no common spiritual denominator. Neither has the UN, nor, really, the European Union. So far, the EU can only boast of a common economic desire to become more prosperous and a common defense against outside enemies, without any aggressive drive. Under these circumstances, its coat of arms should be a fat porcupine, a beast fairly safe in its natural surroundings, but not a valid symbol for Europe.
The porcupine.
That's a pretty good one.
The
That's pretty
porcupine
good.
at the end. I don't know if that was intentional, but that's excellent, actually.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Ah.
Andrew, you're muted.
I have to say that was a really good one. That made me chuckle.
Same. It's like all the libertarians have porcupines as their profile pic on Twitter or season right now.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Idcast, for reading. That was
Excellent.
absolutely
read.
incredible.
Yeah.
I'm always impressed with Ledin. Like every I can read the same.
Mhm.
I think I've listened to Monarchy and War, I think 4 times now, and every time I'm just blown away. I can't get enough of him. It's incredible.
He drives this point home with historical examples which feel a lot more real than Hoppe, who is very much an a priori rationalist guy. And then it's much easier to then, if you read Hoppe and then apply those principles to what you're reading in Ledin, you're like, oh, I can now make sense of history. Instead of like having these free-floating principles that you can't apply or don't know how to because you don't know what to read historically. Ledin sort of really fills that application gap because he already knows, he's already familiar with everything Hoppe knows, basically. He already agrees with all those basic economic and all of those basic economic principles of wars, private actors, private states, whatever. So he's sort of, and because of his historical knowledge, he just applies it. And it feels much more immediate than Hoppe's very brutal Teutonic style.
I feel like it's a narrative. That's why it's a lot easier to grasp. People grasp the truth of narratives a whole lot easier than they do the theory or facts.
Yeah,
and
that's why a lot. Yeah, that's why like something like his Rothbard's historical essays, like in the progressive era, are a much easier read than Man, Economy, and State. You can read you can read 10 progressive eras in the time it takes to read one Man, Economy, and State. Because, oh man, I speak from experience here. Oh man, is that a tough read?
Man, Economy and States, like that's like a 1,000-page tome or something like that.
Yeah.
That thing's huge.
Even Human Action is easier to read despite being
800
roughly
pages.
the same length. Because Mises will just break out, okay, this is the effects of the Industrial Revolution as an application to my principles, and so on and so forth. And he'll go out in these tangents. And Rothbard, being a very disciplined economist, will not allow himself to do so.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the point he brought up about how the Germans wanted to get basically civilized war a little bit with their treaties and we're dropping bombs and planes and that kind of stuff. And allies and not allies, Europe was kind of like, no, that's bad. Right? We might civilize war. We have to make, we can't civilize war because that'd be like accepted as a norm. And it's like, you
boy, did they underestimate that.
I was fuming listening to that part. I was like, what the
fuck? And I've heard that idea a lot, actually. I think I've heard it many times, actually. The idea, look, we can't civilize war, else we'll make it desirable. I think even the great Robert E. Lee said something, it's good that war is so terrible or else it'd be so enjoyable or something like that. It's like, well, that hasn't really stopped wars and their horrors, has it? Yeah. Hasn't really decreased it.
No, definitely has to increase that horizontalism, particularly when bombs flattening the place. What I really like about the narrative for this these past 3 chapters was that it really paints the death cult for what it is. And it's like, because he says like a few times, and he makes this point repeatedly, that like liberation I should say like death or precedes the liberation. You're liberated and like, it's off with your head. And and he makes that point repeatedly that like they always come together. One might follow the other, and in no particular order, but they always come together. And and I really like what he's pointing out here is that just how utterly violent and senseless this high time preference is. And this is why I say democracy is definitionally uncivilized. It just means strength of the people. And it just means, it's just a free for all brawl. No one is ruling. To rule means you apply rules and order, law and order. It doesn't mean that like someone's aggressing against you. It just means someone's giving rules, that allow people to have a sense of the natural order. And when you get into democracy, it's to hell in a handbasket, because now you can vote to basically take stuff away from other people. You can socialize property. I mean, so democracy is the pre-stage of it's the stage prior to socialism. And this is something that Vladimir Lenin actually pointed out in his book. I'm blanking on the name.
State and Revolution.
State and Revolution. There we go. Yeah, State and Revolution. He points out that we push democracy so that we can get to socialism, and because those two are on the same logical spectrum. And you see how very it's this high time preference that makes it so uncivilized, that because low time preference is what causes civilization. It causes deferral of gratification, in which compounding interest and building trust, building wealth, whereas high time preference consumes all of that and squanders it. And so you get from to where it used to be illegal and just evil to go to war. You had no right to go to war if you weren't wearing a uniform. And then it very quickly after the French Revolution, it got to the point where you're not wearing a uniform. You have no idea, and you have no ability to tell who the enemy is or not. And because of that, it makes a lot more sense to just shoot civilians, because you can't tell. The enemy is not wearing a uniform, so you can't tell who's who. And this is why the British would wear red uniforms, is that they could tell who the enemy was and who the enemy wasn't. Whereas in the American Revolution, they weren't always wearing uniforms. Sometimes they were. They tried. They had some honor, whereas the French had none. And they weren't always. But the Americans weren't always wearing. They even if they weren't in a uniform, they were usually with people who were wearing red uniforms, and were obviously gunned. Had guns, and they looked like soldiers. So you could still kind of tell that this is a soldier. And this is why the British didn't have to start just killing civilians, because that's, if you don't know who the enemy is, if you're in the Taliban, you might have to just start killing civilians, and that because you can't tell who the enemy is. And it's this democracy that naturally just uncivilizes people. I mean, it is an uncivilized mechanism. Yeah. And I'll make more points on that later, but you guys can comment.
I really the part when he brought up multiple times of how people would go through the Roman sandals to make chains. And it reminded me of how it used to be, the Catholic Church was the intermediary between the states. It was it was the first system of international law, and these people were trying to go back to the old ways when the other side was clearly trying to progress forward into something brand new. And they rejected the old ways, and they kept the fact they went through Roman sandals to try to for surrendering. The unconditional surrender policy prevented that. It's just absurd.
Exactly. And that they I mean, and you see with Churchill, he wanted the war.
Famously. Way before it started. I think he wanted it since 32 or something.
Yeah. I mean, the dude was fucked up by the First World War. And this guy, I mean, he was like a John McCain type character, where he was absolutely, just fucked in the head by war. I mean, it just absolutely screwed with his brain, and then he got a taste of power, and he just wanted to kind of relive his traumas.
Yeah, he actually fought in the Boer War as well. He didn't fight in this. Yeah, he was famously responsible for the Gallipoli disaster in the First World War, which is still a cause of resentment from the Australians to this day to British rule.
I really like the part about when he democratized. Let me just mute my phone real quick. When war democratized, he really decentralizes the how to put this, becomes a war on culture pretty much, because now it's a war against the ruling class, it's a war on the people. So the attacking of churches and monasteries, of the traditional like cultural landmarks. Now it's a war on culture, and it's just it's so much more brutal in so many ways.
Well, it's like kill the idea. That's why he mentions that the difficulty, one of the worst results of democratization of wars was and remains the difficulty of terminating a war by peace, or at least a lengthy period of peace.
Yeah,
this is because in democracy you fight a war for ideology, and there's no killing a fucking idea.
Not only do you fight a war for ideology, but you fight a war between peoples. It's inherently exterminationist, because it's all these peoples against all those peoples. All the peoples are involved in the war in some way because it's democratic. It's all they're all soldiers in one, directly or indirectly, and so they're all to be regarded as enemy combatants.
Cass, you guys need to add, or you resting your voice to read it?
I was trying to rest a little bit. I think it's interesting that they mentioned some of the bombing efforts, especially during the Second World War, where it's like, okay, they didn't want to take any flak, so just drop the bombs wherever, it doesn't matter if it's in the middle of the city or if it's actually hitting the targets. And this sort of idea of trying to, and we see it now in a lot of different ways in terms of economic sanctions, that sort of thing, is okay, how do we need to punish the citizens for this war that we oppose. And it's this detachment from that. I think this comes in the footnotes. There's this very clear idea that the wars, sort of pre 1789, were wars between monarchs, and they would fund it themselves, and they would hire the mercenaries themselves, and the citizens would try to stay out of the way as much as possible. And with democratization, you have this idea, okay, now it's because this is ultimately, we consider this the fault of the citizens. We know one really directly in a lot of cases blames the rulers in a democracy for the wars that they start. It becomes excusable to, okay, we need to inflict physical, mental, economic, emotional harm on the people, destroying their monuments, destroying their churches, nuking their cities, so that even if they are not directly responsible, they will rise up and overthrow their rulers.
Which is so ridiculous. How are the people going to rise up and overthrow the government? Come on. Yeah, it's like, if
Well,
you're
they're
fighting a
fighting
war to overthrow the government and you can't do it, how the fuck are the people going to do it?
Yeah.
And but it's so much worse than that too, because he makes this point that the like these rulers who are doing this for political reasons, not for military reasons, because they want to get reelected. And if the boys start dying, that's gonna cause a lot of hatred and gonna really hurt the war effort. So he's naturally incentivized to let the planes fly a lot higher instead of a lot lower, where they can be shot at, so that his own people don't die. Even if they don't hit the target, they end up hitting innocent civilians. And so the Democrats are actually incentivized to be more bloodthirsty in war, and to have an ideology that rationalizes this sort of behavior. There's all those people, they have bad ideas anyway, so they're bad people and they deserve to die. And it's a monstrous and you're painting all of these people as innocent people as just guilty of deserving of death for no reason. You see this thing in today, like with the Muslims in Afghanistan. The vast majority of these people are just not terrorists; they just don't want to be involved, and very few of them are like the Taliban or Al Qaeda. And so, but all the same, we drone bombed a house and we killed a bunch of children. Oh well, and
at least they weren't voters, right?
Yeah, at least they're not our voters. Yeah, exactly. And it's just this absolute, and it's like they train their actual voters to hate the enemy. He mentions this here, where he says, "Hey, since these people had been taught to hate the enemy, the agitated masses in reality voted for, even if indirectly, these dictates that what the treaties supposedly actually were." And in Britain, we had the famous khaki election, an orgy of demagoguery, in which Lloyd George promised to ruin the German middle class, it ran on ruining their middle class. Not the Kaiser, not Hitler, the middle class. What the fuck? Like, Jesus,
That's
man.
such an insane statement.
It's like, by the way, this is the same exact reason they hate capitalism, because that's a monarchy as well. It's like they train their people to to always hate anyone who could possibly oppose them, who thinks differently than them. And like this is the sort of thing that they do is in order to maintain their power, is they always keep that hatred going in a different direction. I mean, this is the and to the point, like they do not care about like killing innocent people. That's why I say it's so ironic when they're the ones saying that, oh, we should hang the Kaiser, and really they're the ones who like should be hung. It's funny because they're like, and what did this cause? Like back then they were like, oh, the Kaiser is the most evil man in the world. He's basically Hitler. And they're like, who's Hitler? It's like, we didn't get that guy yet. We got him. We got Hitler because of the republic they created after they got rid of the monarch.
I think Eric doesn't really get the Ludin doesn't really quite get into this, but something I think is interesting is he mentioned, I think what we read last time, he talked a lot about the propaganda and being able to demonize and dehumanize the enemy. But I think something that you also that's sort of necessary for that is there needs to be suffering of the native people. Like what you see a lot in a lot of modern American conflicts is people are dying overseas, and it's not that we necessarily hate them; it's just a lot of Americans just don't care. And I think it's when we start seeing Americans suffering, usually because of the actions of our own government, that you're going to start seeing that serious hatred for the other. I think you see that a lot, certainly in World War I and World War II, especially in the UK, and that's why they were so eager to enact their revenge on the Germans, because the British suffered so terribly under their own government, particularly in World War II. And I wonder about as the sort of American empire begins its decline. And if things do get bad here, how much more effective does that propaganda become when people actually start to suffer? Because we've had, a generation now where we've been able to wage wars overseas, and you don't necessarily have to hate the enemy too much. You can just ignore that they're dying. I think that the hatred might get turned up as soon as there's a reason for it. Even if
this
it's
is why
misplaced.
I want to really start taking over the education system with the GOP Mises Caucus, is that we need to be pushing ideology like this in the schools, about monarchy and war, but about, hey, this is the sort of thing that they do. And like in places where you have home rule, is like you need to be like actively educating people on here's how they work. And this is a monstrous ideology. Democracy is incredibly uncivilized, and yes, republics are democracies. And this is what they do. This is what they've always done. Again, look at Rome. They had, in their first 230 years, America's about 230 years old. In their first 230 years, they had 26 civil wars. That's just the civil wars. That doesn't count the external wars with other people that they had. I mean, this is a blood-soaked ideology. And so the people are not educated about it. They have this idea that liberation means peace. No, liberation is a death cult. It means death every time. The liberation is always preceded by lots of death. And it's like this thing is death from beginning to end. And and the people are just, they don't know anything. They're not taught their history. Their history is hidden from them. I mean, you think the Protestants don't know their history? Imagine the regular people who just don't know anything.
There's a great line Ludin has here, which he says, a democracy as democratism is a Gnostic ideology hell-bent on saving the world. I love that it's also it's emphasizing that it is sort of a Christian heresy in a sense, because it's Gnostic. It's not only just Neoplatonic or whatever. It's specifically a Christian heresy.
Go ahead.
Sure. So I was in line with what Andrew was saying in terms of this being a death cult. I think we hear a lot about how socialism and communism are willing. There's no number of deaths that will that will not be that if they're in service to the revolution, they're okay. Ludin mentions obviously famously the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but I think in some ways even more horrifically in Dresden, which was just completely unnecessary, did nothing towards any kind of war aims. But there's this idea that, okay, yeah, we killed 200,000 people. Some of them are our own soldiers, most of them civilians, none of them combatants really, or that hadn't surrendered. But it was worth it in service to this ideology. Is there's even for democracy, there's no number of casualties that are not acceptable if it can be claimed to be in service of this death cult of democracy. This reified democracy in the same way that the revolution of socialism doesn't matter how many people you kill if it moves towards it. Yeah, exactly.
And it's like, and you see this, like, when they shout, like, I noticed that, like he points out how the difference in temperament of the monarch versus the Democrat, and where he's like, like when the Prussian king, was meeting with, Napoleon III. He was like, one of them is like really self-controlled, good manners, generosity. Like that's how a monarch, behaves. Whereas the other guy is like death to the monarch or death to America, which by the way, is why Iran is actually a republic. It's not a monarchy. It's not a theocracy. It's
it has too much democracy for its own good into the theocracy.
Yeah. I mean, technically theocracy is always democracy. So like,
fair enough.
Because who put those people in charge? They're not monarchs. They can't hand this thing down to their kids. So
on that point, when he brought up how monarchy is handed, the kingdom was handed down to the kids like a trade. It reminded me of I think it's, and I was reading Sirach. Sirach 10 talks about white justice of a king, and he literally talks and Sirach talks about trades, the trade going from like a artisan to another artisan to king, that kind of thing. He literally uses the same exact example that's used in Sirach in the Monarchy and War piece, which I thought was really so in the Catholic side there. But one thing I really like about Monarchy and War, and really showing how what's worse war is under democracy and preferable under monarchy. Excuse me. There are a lot of libertarians whose litmus test is, are you anti-war? That's a whole stick, is anti-war libertarians. And a lot of those same people are very opposed to ideas of like monarchy or Harper or Ludin or that kind of stuff. And it's kind of ridiculous. It's like if you guys were really focused on anti-war, you would be pushing for a much more attainable goal of democracy. I mean, of monarchy opposed to anarchy, and they're not. And it's
because they're not real like libertarians; they're liberationists. It's like they don't believe in private property because they really want private property. They believe in it because they want freedom from authority. Whereas a more right wing libertarian believes in private property because he wants good authority. He wants legitimate authority. And he's like, if you put Hoppe in front of them, if you put Yarvin in front of them, they're like, these guys make a ton of sense. I like what they have to say. If you put Hoppe in front or Yarvin in front of your liberationists, that like left libertarians, they're just liberationists. It's like they start reading. They find all sorts of problems and they hate these people. They're like, what a bigot or something like that. And, they find whatever excuse they can to just dismiss the guy for whatever reason, even if they don't care about that particular reason, because the real reason is that, these are people who represent legitimate authority and they don't want legitimate authority. They don't want any kind of authority. And that's why they're, these are the kind of libertarians that I really try to seek out and push away, embarrass, block them. I'm utterly hostile to these sorts of people because I believe in private property. I'm with the GOP Mises Caucus because I want legitimate authority based on private property, which is what, sanctioned by the natural law, according to, I think it was Pius the 12th, I think, who said, it's sanctioned by the natural law. And it's like all of the the pre-Vatican II popes were really, really based. When it came to that. But you see, I like how Ledeen puts this right here. That Professor, excuse me.
We are the most
Yeah,
coughing
that's
podcast ever. It's like we
I
are
know.
COVID or something.
I know.
I've muted myself for every cough so far, but there's been quite a few actually.
I need to be hovering over the mute button now. Professor Hans Hoppe, in an essay which likens the democratic procedure to a small child wanting his wishes fulfilled immediately and protests in tears if there is a delay or negative reaction. A monarch, as a member of a dynasty, can plan for the distant future, even for generations. And I put a comment right here that you actually have two extremes here. And these are not actually what you want. And this is why, I like corporate statecraft as an idea much better, because it does balance these out somewhat. Whereas like democracy, you have really high time preference consumption on one side, whereas on the other side you have really, really, really low time preference, but most people are somewhere in the middle. So if you understand, most people are somewhere in the middle, and democracy and monarchy both have you out on the extremes. This is going to be chaotic. This is going to be problematic. What you really need is something that has a little bit closer to a middle time preference that is slanted to the one side, to the one side being low time preference. And this is something that corporations actually do really, really well, where they'll make like 5-year plans basically, and they will budget for about 5 years in the future. And it's like not the best thing in the world. You kind of want it at generations, but this is a much better than what you have with democracy, of course, and is closer to the average person and what what the customers want, compared to a classical monarchy. And it also can be much, much more aggressive about, proactively applying order and planning for it, and getting rid of all of the causes of chaos, or proactively getting rid of perturbations of the natural order. And this is the, it's like, I really like. There's one word that I think is comment that's really related to that concept. That he says, yet dentists, lawyers, cobblers, farmers, or plumbers could not have produced any clothes. Where he's talking about, hey, like a clothes person, a tailor hands his trade craft down to his kid, just like the king does to his, just like the king does for his son. And if the tailor sometimes produce bad garments, but most of them get it pretty good. Mm-hmm. And some of them do fantastic work. Whereas if you tried to have dentists and lawyers and cobblers and all that try to make clothes, they come out as abominations. And it's like, cool, now try statecraft. You know what I mean? It's like, mm-hmm. I mean, that's his point right here, is that it's like, nobody, it would say that, hey, let's all try to make clothes for ourselves. These are all going to come out awful, except for the people who actually know how to do it. And yet there's this idea in democracy that, every vote counts, or everyone, every opinion is just as valid as the next one.
Everyone matters.
And they all matter equally, and this pluralism and this bullshit like that. And it's like, of course not. It's like it's an obvious place where this should not be the case. And we don't do this anywhere else. And we assume, but it's just like taken as a given here that, that this is the right and moral thing, that everyone should have an equal say in, how statecraft should be made. But they have no clue how this thing is done. And this is like, and you would never do this in any other industry, any other service. It's not, well, except for religion. I have to point that out with the Protestants. Yeah, that is like, okay, mm-hmm. And by the way, those two are related. Politics and religion are intrinsically related. Mm-hmm.
And I think to your point about, like, I mean, why should we not let market mechanisms dictate who is in charge of statecraft like we do for everything else? And also, you mentioning that sort of corporatism has this sort of nice middle ground in terms of time precedence, but because it responds to market incentives, it can raise or lower time preference in accordance with what the populace would like. Again, can it get to generational time frames? Maybe not, but whether or not a 5-year plan is appropriate, or a 1-year plan, or a 20-year plan is going to be dictated by the market.
Well, it's going to be dictated by the profit mechanism. Right. It's like that. That's the best, because you do have industries like the lumber industry, which like, okay, that tree takes like 15, 20 years to grow. You got to plan for the future with that one. And you see this with like agriculture too. There are industries that do this where they will plan years and years in advance, like many years in advance. And so the market is fully capable of doing this because of that profit mechanism. So whatever maximizes that kind of profit, excuse me. I missed the button again. But this is why, because of that. You do get something more of a middle preference with corporations, but it's slanted to the right, to towards low time preference because of that profit mechanism. It has to be produced. Profit has to be produced. Because it has a real existence, and you can't simply predate it because you wouldn't have anything to predate. You have to, the profit has to be produced before someone can predate it. You know what I mean? And so this is something Rothbard talked about in Anatomy of the State. And so this is always so corporations always going to have closer to a middle preference that's slanted rightward, slanted towards low time preference. And how slanted that is depends on, what's the time scale of this. And so, a corporation, it may have a normal corporation might have a 5-year time span, but a state corporation might very well have a very long time span as well. That might be close to intergenerational. It might be it's like very super generational, where they're planning like centuries in advance. That could easily be the case, but usually not. Usually it's going to be a little bit closer to the middle. Like even, and by the way, if our government were even planning 8 years in advance, that would still be a huge improvement. At least a fourfold improvement, because they're not even planning for they're planning 2 years in advance, but they're planning for the next election, not for the betterment of the people.
Well, that's what's so interesting to me is I would think sort of the highest you can get time preference in our current system would be 2 years. We plan when's the next election. I swear it's gotten shorter. I really think that watching the way that the U.S. is being governed right now, that no one is even thinking to November right now, because if they would,
feels month to month, at least on Twitter.
Unless there is some larger plan, if these people are planning on being reelected, they're really bad at it. They sort of will realize some point over the summer, oh yeah, we need to start getting out messaging so we can get reelected.
Trust the plan, man. Trust the plan.
They have been working for 2 years towards re-elections. So their time preference is even higher than that.
The shadows planning for the next 20 elections.
I like Time Magazine Part 2: How We Fortified This Election.
Right. Yeah.
It's at this point, I say okay, they're definitely not planning for the future at all. They're just reacting at this point. This is pure action reaction right now, and this is not planning for the future at all. And so, it's I have to think these people have got to be smarter than that. Are they planning?
So I think this is one of the things I love about going off topic a little bit. But Hayek's road to serfdom is this idea of why the worst end up at the top is that you have incentivized the kind of people that have incredibly high time preference, the kind of people that could get to their primary, they could get to they can get to next month in as most devious and advantageous a manner as possible, and that don't think more than a week or a month ahead. Whatever the highest time preference that can survive is the one that's going to end up thriving. And so what you see is leadership has just become entirely that kind of individual who can't even look to the next election. Even
the one who's willing to squander the most social trust is the one who gets elected.
But also because if the person who can plan 20 years in advance is not necessarily the person who can produce results in a year or fake results or whatever you want, so they're not going to get elected. Well, even if this is assuming that democracy is results-based here, which is a very kind and generous assumption on my part, but still, for the sake of argument, it still sort of completely falls apart then, because the person who can plan ahead and deliver you a prosperous nation in 20 years' time might not be the person who can make you feel good in a year.
Well, it's like the person who can, do it in 20 years and actually do a really, really fantastic job. They're able to do it because it's private property. You know what I mean? It's like these are the people with that kind of mindset. That's where that mindset goes. They don't go to the I always marvel at these businessmen who are like, oh, I'm a successful businessman. I'm going to get in there and I'm going to change the system. And it's like there is no corporation on the planet that runs itself like the U.S. federal government. It's not just And I don't just mean like, like a ship of drunken sailors. What I mean is that it's a ship of drunken sailors that fight with each other at every single decision and undermine each other at every single decision. And there's nobody in charge. And it's like, there is no business that runs by simply fighting with itself, all day long and sniping at each other all day long. This is a business that would go out of business in like a month. This would never exist. And so when a businessman is trying to get in there, like, and he's like, going to be flabbergasted. Like, I can't believe anybody would do it. Like, yeah, this is why we shouldn't run the government this way. That's exactly why, the reason why we have all of these businessmen coming in here to fix the system is exactly why we shouldn't run the government this way.
American democracy is a ship of drunken sailors headed by a senile captain with a drug addict for a son.
Well,
so things are going well.
I mean, that's the real risk of monarchy, is that like you could end up with a senile old man run by handlers and underlings as your ruler. I mean, God,
that is the worst case scenario for monarchy.
Well, we've gone for an hour. Oh, go ahead.
And I was going to say, actually, the real worst case is you could get like a Joffrey Baratheon type sociopath reptile, like Kamala Harris in charge. Oh God!
I would say the same thing.
Too soon.
The same thing.
Too soon. Knock on wood. Don't jinx us.
Lord willing, we won't get her. It's weird. I like how to put this. The hope a president doesn't like die in office is weird for an anarchist, but I think a lot of anarchists are actually like praying that Biden lives, and it's just a testament to how crazy the times are nowadays.
I hope Biden lives to see Roe v. Wade repealed. I hope we get our first.
do his Catholic heart proud. Yeah.
We have to. Yeah, well, I say we. I'm not American, but America has to have Roe v. Wade repealed with a nominally Catholic president. Well, I don't say. Well, not nominally. If he's baptized, then he is technically Catholic, and I hope he does repent. I do pray for his repentance for any private sins he has done, which are probably many.
He's a lowercase c Catholic.
Yeah. But I do pray he has at least a final moment before his death. He's safe between the saddle and the ground.
In his final moment of lucidity before the true senility kicks in. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I hope so.
Boy, that's a God, the chances are low.
The chances are low, but hey, dare we hope.
Well, we've gone for an hour. Anybody have anything else they want to say before I announce the next live reading we're doing?
Let me see. There's a few things that we could have gotten into Nagasaki that I brought up, such as I think few people know that St. Maximilian Kolbe he founded one of the churches that survived in Nagasaki after the bombing. If we got into that, I would have brought that up. But aside from that, which I was, bringing on, I think we talked briefly about Nagasaki, Hiroshima, and Dresden. So that was enough to touch on what Ledin was talking about. So aside from that, I don't really have much.
And just to add on to that very briefly, and I think Ludin does an excellent job sort of weaving in the religious subtext. As a Catholic, it's not overt, but it's there. And he mentions in a footnote about how Nagasaki was the cradle of the Catholic Church in Japan.
Yes, very much so.
That Wilson managed.
The oldest Catholic church in Japan, Odan Catholic Church, is in Nagasaki, 3 miles from the ground zeros of the bomb.
And then with that Truman did a better job of wiping out Catholicism in Japan than 250 years of the emperor ever could.
Yeah, very true. Actually, very, very true.
Very true. Andrew, any final points?
Nope.
Okay, well, the next live reading we're going to do.
One final point. I do have one after all. He says, when he talked about the UN, neither has the UN nor really the European Union so far. The EU can only boast of economic desire to become more prosperous and a common defense against the outside enemies, but without any aggressive drive whatsoever. Like, this is definitely a reference to the LP. Oh, this is like one of the best references to the LP. It's like, a desire to become prosperous.
A vague desire.
One day we're going to spread that message. Yep.
Yeah.
Boy, timeless truth.
There were a few digs here. I feel like I don't know when this was written. I know he died in 99, I think it was.
So I was trying to find a date on it. It looks like this was published posthumously, though. The earliest thing I see anywhere is 2000, so just after his death. And for some context, I think this was about a year before Democracy God That Failed. So
yeah, this might have been a talk. I have the impression it was, and then made to an essay for a book collection, I think.
That was about my Godfather.
So this was probably a talk a few years before he died, I think.
Yeah.
Which really speaks to the man's activity, being able to deliver one hell of a talk in his final years.
Apparently, he spoke like 12 languages or something, a whole bunch of languages.
He was a polyglot.
He spoke Japanese, and I need to make Eric Vaughn then like weeb memes, like him holding like a waifu pillow and like make some weeb memes. I think that'd be a very funny way to like the Hopper weeb memes. We need to make the Hopper.
You're really gonna have to explain those to him in paradise. He's not gonna be so pleased.
Also, we might need a veggie tail for him as well.
Oh yeah, I will contact Sam and ask him to make another one. Anyway, so the next live we were going to do. I have to find a PDF for this one because I don't have a physical copy, but it's going to be The Three Reformers by Jacques Maritain, Lucer, Descartes, and Rousseau. A reformer of religion, a reformer of philosophy, and a reformer of morality, and the connections between them. It's going to be
revolutionaries.
Yeah, he's very kind. We briefly talked about this in the GC. Revolutionaries, reform is
it's like, why in the world do we call this a reform? It's much more like a usurpation or like a revolution. It's like calling it the French Reformation. It's like, okay, I suppose that's kind of accurate.
I made the point in the GC that we call it the French Revolution and not civilizational apocalypse. So hey, whatever, we're used to it. Why not on terms?
It's gonna be a lot of fun.
Start calling it the French Reformation from now. But Jacques Maritain.
Yeah, Maritain is fantastic. Just a brilliant early 20th century, I guess. I don't have his dates in front of me, but
early to mid, I think.
I noticed it. I know he's mentioned in Andrew's book he's reading right now.
Live reading. Very fun fact that I discovered recently. Do you know who Biden says is his favorite Catholic philosopher?
Who?
Maritain. No one else.
No way.
And I doubt he has read any Maritain. This is real. Someone has asked him this question. This is what he said. And I think Unheard had an article I don't think he has read any Maritain.
That cannot possibly be the case.
No, he just had to pick a name. He probably just guessed the first name and got it right.
I think I know why. Because in politics, Maritain was the closest thing to you can come to being really good and everything else in a shitlib, because he helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for the UN. So he's famous in secular circles for that. So I think that's why he must have picked him.
Okay, that makes more sense.
I know he's mentioned by Marcel. How do you say his last name?
Lefebvre.
I know he's mentioned by then I got the book and I saw looked through the table of contents. And I saw Maritain. I'm like,
he's there all over the place.
It's weird. People I love don't like disagree with each other. It's always weird to read two people. I like both of you guys. Like reading Kaczynski and Land at the same time. It's but yeah, Jacques Martin's Degrees of Knowledge is incredible. And this book, I'm only through the first couple chapters, but yeah, we're gonna have a lot of fun with this one.
Mm-hmm. All right. So,
but anyway, go ahead. Uncast, give your plug. Let's have you go first. And again, thank you for reading.
Yeah, of course. Happy to do it. It's at Eincath on Twitter, AnarchoCatholic.substack.com. I'm trying to up the content. It's about one a month so far. And most of those things, if they're at all relevant to the content you've heard here, get cross-posted to what is now actually Austro-Thomism.com, if I'm not mistaken. We have the URL secure thanks to Caleb's undying efforts.
Oh, wow.
Well, I have secured the URL, but the website will not how do I put this? I go to all the steps, and it gets to the last step. We'll go, okay, publish a new website, and then it's stuck on that page for 24 hours and won't move past it. And so I have
at some point we'll be at Austro-Thomism.
It's probably gonna be another week before the website is up again.
It wouldn't be Austro-Thomism without technical difficulties. I think we can all admit that. It'd be something else.
I'm probably gonna have to hire a dude, honestly. I'm tired of dealing with it. Andrew, what do you plug? Where can people find you at?
You can find me at Popular Liberty _ on Twitter, where you can see me dunking on Protestants and shit libs all over the place. And you can also find me at Popular Liberty on YouTube, where I'm going to be posting chapter 6 of They Have Uncrowned Him by Marcel Lefebvre tomorrow. It's about a 2-hour discussion with my good friend and co-host LB Muniz, and where the subject is going to be the necessity of inequality, and we're also going to be able to dunk on libertarians at the same exact time, because their liberty and equality are two sides of the same coin, in terms of errors that they both presume to be. Like, I'm born this way. That's why you can't touch me. I'm born free and I'm born equal. It's like, nope. And so I'm going to be posting that tomorrow. And if you also want to help out at the GOP Mises Caucus, where I think we have an Austro-Thomism. I'm pretty sure we have an Austro-Thomism link. I'm pretty sure I gave you one, Caleb.
I think you gave me one. I think you gave me one for Faith, Liberty, and Praxis, but not for Austro-Thomism. I still haven't said the Faith, Liberty, and Praxis one.
All right. Well, I will. But okay. Well, I'll add a link for that. But for now, just misesgop.org/donate. And again, we can probably get back to corporate statecraft and monarchy fairly quickly. I think this is actually going to be a much cheaper, better, faster solution to getting to real liberty for the people who actually want it. Not all libertarians do. They're just anti-authority, as we discussed. Well,
Bulgakov, what are your plugs?
Sure. Yeah, it's just the @ you can see here on the video, @ available username. Bulgakov's Behemoth is my tag. I don't know. I write for Austro-Thomism. I'm trying to come up with an article this weekend. Already have the idea. It's about the science TM and subversion of like folk norms, how we regard each other and how we interact. It's a concept I think Roger Scruton touched on it on Human Nature, but other writers such as Peter Giergj, scholastic philosopher of the 20th century, have touched on as well. So it'll probably be relatively short, but I'll try to condense Giergj and Scruton into it. So that's what I'll hopefully be finishing this weekend. But that's about it. I don't really post anywhere else outside from Twitter and Austro-Thomism.
Awesome. Well, you can find me on Twitter at CalebBrown549. Make sure you like, comment, share, subscribe. Go follow Austro-Thomism on Twitter. Side note for my show, we have Saturday. I'm having LB Muniz on for an episode on why most libertarians don't understand philosophy. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Yeah,
that's going to be a really short episode.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be hard. It's going to be a very fun one. But it's we'll talk about it after. I got a lot of cool notes for that one. But yeah, that's we got more stuff in the works. The website's gonna be back up soon. We got more live readings, more articles. We're gonna cover the next 5 proofs of existence of God, and soon then we're gonna go into some actual Austrian economics and do who's Hussmann's books on it again? It's
Mahidon's books. It's Rousseau, Locke, and Luther.
Ethics of Money Production by Guido.
Okay. Said who's?
We're gonna eventually cover that as a book club with I think it was Anglo. We picked for that one. And
I
then,
need to read that one.
Yeah,
I haven't read any Hussmann aside from a few papers.
Oh, he's amazing. We focused really too much on Thomism for a little too long. We gotta actually incorporate the Austrian side.
Yeah, I gotta get outside. Okay, here's the ontology of being. Like, no, let's get into the Austro part for a little bit.
Exactly. But anyway, yeah, you guys, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for being a part of this whole program. I'm really enjoying the work we're putting out. So, yeah, everyone have a good night.